"Go, go, go," said the bird. "Humankind cannot bear very much reality." "By this radiance, my child, I swear, by this bright orb which sees and hears us now, that from this being which you now behold and which rules the world, you have your origin, child of the sun." The wise see in their heart, in their spirit, the bird anointed with the magic of Asura. The poets see him inside the ocean. The sages seek the footprints of his rays. The bird carries in his heart speech that the divine youth spoke of inside the womb. The poets guard this revelation that shines like the sun and the footprint of order. I have seen the cowherd who never tires, moving to and fro along the paths, clothing himself in those that move towards the same center but spread apart. He rolls on and on inside the worlds. Hello, noble friends. Welcome to Premier Top Philosophy. I'm Dr. Peter Yong, and today I'd like to explore the strange roots of Western philosophy in the figure of Parmenides of Elea and his great work. Though laid near in clear and simple words, Phoebus's truth is difficult to grasp. Consider the injunction, "Know thyself," emblazoned in gold on the forecourt of Apollo's temple at Delphi. Two straightforward words, know thyself. Yet the god's command could easily take lifetimes to understand, much less fulfill. One might be tempted to think that we would, in our self-obsessed age, be closer to satisfying the far shooter's demand than the Greeks to whom it was first delivered. Have we not been weaned on Polonius's dictum, "To thine own self be true," and sung ourselves since the days of Whitman? Indeed, uncontent to sound our barbaric yops over the roofs of the world, we have managed to screech ourselves into a variety of virtual ones. We have invented the field of psychotherapy to fabricate, then dissect our individual neuroses, traumas, and personal histories, and provide us with proper diagnostic labels for our afflictions. Labels we pin with pride as identities to be exhibited like rare insects on display. We have invented life coaching to free us from limiting beliefs and help us awaken the giants within. And we have invented marketing and the concept of the personal brand to commodify ourselves and connect with our own unique tribe, i.e., niche market. Given the time and attention thus devoted to the cultivation of the modern self, one might believe us closer to self-knowledge than our ancestors. Yet we aren't, and deep down, we know we aren't. We remain as much an enigma to ourselves as ever, and by making our subjectivity into an object, whether it be one of the diseases of the psychotherapists, the comic book characters of the life coaches, or the commodities of the marketers, we have grown only yet more alienated from ourselves. Despite our culture's obsession with self-development, the ancient Greeks may have been in a better position to know themselves than we. To them, Apollo's demand for self-knowledge would not have been seen as an injunction to articulate an idiosyncratic personality with its unique preferences and desires, but rather as a call to recognize the kind of being that one is. To live well, for the Greeks, is to live virtuously, to live with arete. But different kinds of beings have different virtues in virtue of their different natures. An excellent knife cuts well. An excellent horse runs well. But it would be foolish to judge a horse as defective because it can't slice bread. The arete of each thing depends on the kind of thing that it is. So, to flourish as humans, we must know ourselves. Know what man is. When understood in this manner, the command to know thyself correlates with the command inscribed next to it at Delphi. Nothing in excess. To know the kind of being you are is to keep within your bounds. And for us mortals, the dying ones, this primarily means avoiding the hubris of seeking what belongs only to the deathless gods. A life of unmixed good. Such a view is expressed in the famous passage about Zeus's two urns in Book 24 of the Iliad. In it, Achilles tries to comfort King Priam by declaring, quote, "Such is the way the gods spun life for unfortunate mortals, that we live in unhappiness. But the gods themselves have no sorrows. There are two urns that stand on the door-sill of Zeus. They are unlike for the gifts they bestow, an urn of evils, an urn of blessings. If Zeus, who delights in thunder, mingles these and bestows them on man, he shifts and moves now in evil, again in good fortune. But when Zeus bestows from the urn of sorrows, he makes a failure of man, and the evil hunger drives him over the shining earth, and he wanders, respected neither of gods nor mortals." End quote. The best mortals can hope for is a mixed life of joy and sorrow. A life of unmixed good belongs only to the gods. But problems remain even for this more classical approach to carrying out Apollo's injunction, since man's being remains problematic. Into what are we inquiring in the question, what is man? And more fundamentally, what do we mean by the more primordial question silently carried within it? What is? The classical view presupposes that the question, what is man, can be answered by identifying the appropriate natural kind to which he belongs. Man is, for example, a featherless biped, a rational animal, a political animal, a creation made in the image of God, a microcosm of the macrocosm, etc. But this strategy presupposes that being can be hacked apart into natural kinds, that each being has an essential nature that falls under a natural kind, and that the best way for understanding being and beings is to subsume beings under their corresponding natural kinds. But once we start examining these presuppositions in more detail, we see that they are far from obvious, and we are forced to address the question of being head-on. Martin Heidegger, the 20th century philosopher who perhaps more than any other forcefully put this question to the modern world, articulated the paradox as follows, quote, "Let us imagine that this inconspicuous little is could not be thought. What would become of our stay in the world if this firm and constantly affirmed is were denied us? And yet, to make clear what to be says, we need only point to some being, a mountain, a house lying before us, a tree standing there. What do we point out when we help ourselves by such indications? We indicate a being, of course, but, strictly speaking, the indication comes to rest on the mountain, the house, the tree. Now we imagine that we have the answer to precisely what is still in question. For we do not, after all, inquire about a being as mountain, as house, as tree, as though we wanted to climb a mountain, move into a house, or plant a tree. We inquire about the mountain, about the house, about the tree as a given being, in order to give thought to the being of the mountain, the being of the house, and the being of the tree. We notice at once, it is true, that being is not attached to the mountain somewhere, or stuck to the house, or hanging from the tree. We notice, thus, the problematic that is designated with being. Our question, therefore, becomes more questioning." End quote. Here, Heidegger points to our tendency to explicate the nature of being by furnishing a set of particular beings. We act as if this gesture explains how beings have their being, and what being is. But Heidegger reveals that it does no such thing. When we point to a mountain, house, or tree, it's not like their being is stuck to them somewhere like a post-it note. Heidegger sees the history of metaphysics, a history he takes to culminate in the rise of modern science and technology, as a prolonged attempt to avoid this question of being. Yet the question, argues Heidegger, was asked at the very outset of what has come to be seen as Western metaphysics by the strange figure of Parmenides. We have largely ignored the man and his uncanny message for all these years, since they challenge us too profoundly. Parmenides and the city of Elea have been, for the most part, elided from the current curriculum of Western philosophy. If you were lucky enough to encounter them at all, you would probably hear something similar to the story I was told early in my philosophical education. According to this story, the city of Elea is famous for producing the so-called Eleatic school of philosophy, of which Parmenides, Zeno, and Melissus are the chief representatives. And the Eleatic worldview promoted by this school denied change and plurality by ignoring perceptual appearances and pursuing instead a rationalistic, i.e. strictly logical approach. Likewise, Parmenides' importance is said to lie in being the primary exponent of this Eleatic position. Bertrand Russell articulates this standard narrative when he maintains, in his popular A History of Western Philosophy, that, quote, "What makes Parmenides historically important is that he invented a form of metaphysical argument that, in one form or another, is to be found in most subsequent metaphysicians down to and including Hegel. He is often said to have invented logic, but what he really invented was metaphysics based on logic." End quote. This narrative is repeated in many other contemporary introductions to Parmenides' thought. The Encyclopaedia Britannica entry on Eleaticism, for example, maintains that Parmenides, by eschewing the senses and relying on pure logic, is the father of pure ontology. And the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on Parmenides, which is in other respects more nuanced, nonetheless concludes by presenting him as the founder of an ontology sundered from theology. Quote, "If Xenophanes can be seen as a founder of rational theology, then Parmenides' distinction among the principal modes of being, and his derivation of the attributes that must belong to what must be, simply as such, qualify him to be seen as the founder of metaphysics or ontology as a domain of inquiry distinct from theology." End quote. Kirk and Raven, likewise, present this position in their book, The Pre-Socratic Philosophers. In it, they claim that Parmenides' way of truth, quote, "presents an unprecedented exercise in logical deduction. Starting from the premise esti, it is, in much the same way as Descartes started from the premise cogito, Parmenides proceeds, by the sole use of reason unaided by the senses, to deduce all that can be known about being, and he ends by denying any truthful validity to the senses, or any reality to what they appear to perceive." End quote. After thus setting forth the importance of Parmenides' work, the instructor committed to the standard narrative will then, with a smirk, cursorily sketch some of Parmenides' allegedly deductive arguments in order to dismiss them, showing how they turn on fundamental confusions between the existential and predicative uses of the word is, and between de dicto and de re necessity. The lesson will then likely conclude by absolving Parmenides from his muddled thinking, by pointing out that he was attempting to philosophize in an archaic age, before the development of the sophisticated conceptual tools of analytic philosophy. At this point, Parmenides is safely consigned to the dustbin of history, never to be thought of again. Yet, despite its popularity, the conventional story about Parmenides is misleading, and, as I shall argue, all of its main claims are false. Elea's significance for the history of Western philosophy transcends being a mere location for the development of a so-called Eleatic monism. And Parmenides' significance transcends being the spokesman of such a doctrine. Nor did Parmenides attempt to establish a rationalist metaphysics through deductive inference. Rather, both Elea and Parmenides are substantially weirder than we commonly assume, and their presence in the history of Western philosophy injects an irreducible element of high-strangeness into the very foundations of Western culture and thought. In what follows, I shall argue that Parmenides was a skilled shaman and experiencer, and that his philosophical poem, On Nature, is best understood as a transcendental phenomenology of two forms of consciousness, with one section, The Way of Truth, focusing on the ecstatic experience of non-ordinary reality, and the other, The Way of Opinion, focusing on the everyday experience of ordinary reality. The story of Parmenides is bound up with the history of the city of Elea. a history stranger and vastly more interesting than what is depicted in the standard narrative. Classicist Peter Kingsley has collected the relevant historical data to show how remarkable Elea was. It was established as a colony of the Phocians, the people of Phocia. The name Phocia means city of seals, the word for seal being phocae, and Kingsley points out that seals had a special significance in Greek imagination. They were thought to be the ideal amphibian, dwellers in two worlds, equally at home on land and at sea, magical beings capable of changing their shape and opening and closing the ocean's doors. This, perhaps, is why Homer declares them dear to Thetis, the sea's lovely lady, and chief of the Nereids, and associates them with Proteus, the old man of the sea. The Phocians, a great seafaring people, lived up to their name. Like the Vikings of more recent times, they were explorers who ventured further than anyone thought possible at the time. Herodotus declares that, quote, "The Phocians were the earliest Greeks to make long voyages by sea. They opened up the Adriatic, Tyrrhenia, Iberia, and Tartessus." End quote. Likewise, Phocian accounts of their voyages up the coast of Spain contain our oldest references to England and Ireland. The 6th century explorer Euthymenes voyaged from the Phocian colony in Massalia, today's Marseille, out past the Strait of Gibraltar and down the coast of Africa to at least Senegal, writing down scrupulously detailed observations about his journey. And Pythias, the greatest Greek explorer who ever lived, left Massalia and traveled north instead of south. He passed Britain, Ireland, and Scotland and arrived at the solid sea of the Arctic Circle, again taking exacting measurements. Measurements so precise that later astronomers used them to map the world. And this was not the end of all the Phocians exploring. The city of Phocia was located on the coast of western Anatolia, what is today Turkey. It lay on the western end of a great caravan route, the so-called Royal Road connecting east and west, and the Phocians were intimately involved with the peoples and cultures of the East. For example, the sculptor Telephanes worked for 2 generations of Persian kings, and the Phocians were so heavily involved in trade with Egypt that they set up their own depots and places of worship there. According to Kingsley, for the Phocians, quote, "Egypt wasn't just some foreign land. It was part of the world they knew and lived and worked in." End quote. For further evidence of the extensive cultural exchange in the region, Kingsley points to the example of the nearby island of Samos, the home of Pythagoras. Legends speak of Pythagoras himself as a world traveler, journeying to Egypt, Phoenicia, Persia, Babylonia, and India to learn wisdom. And Kingsley argues that these legends are not implausible given what we know of the culture at the time. Pythagoras' father was said to have been a gem engraver, a profession which would have required extensive travel. As a gem engraver, he would have needed to learn the skills of engraving from Phoenicia and get his supplies from the east. Additionally, there are the otherwise inexplicable reports of Pythagoras wearing pants, unusual attire in Greece, but customary in Persia. And furthermore, the Samian gem engraver, sculptor, and architect Theodorus, who lived at the same time as Pythagoras, studied in Egypt and worked for the king of Persia. According to Kingsley, quote, "There are good reasons to link him with some of the finest architecture produced right in the heart of ancient Persia itself." End quote. And further evidence for cultural syncretism can also be found in the famous temple of Hera at Samos, the Heraion. Kingsley points out that its 6th century BC overhaul was based on Egyptian models, and that the offerings brought to it came from all over the world, including bronze images from the cult of Gula, the Babylonian goddess of healing, and peacocks from India. Thus, despite the caricature of an insular Greece that somehow managed to create Western civilization ex nihilo, there was, in fact, a vital connection between East and West from the very beginnings of Western culture. especially among peoples like the Samians and Phocians. The Phocians were thus a remarkable people, and the story of the founding of Elea was no less remarkable. Indeed, the story of Elea's founding is worthy of an epic, and feels as if it could have come straight out of the Aeneid. Herodotus relates how, facing the aggressive expansion of the Persian Empire, the Phocians fortified their city with an elaborate wall, thanks to a generous gift from the Tartessian king Arganthonius, with whom they were on good terms. But since the Persians had by then discovered how to scale such walls by amassing earthworks outside them, the strategy proved to be futile. So, when Harpagus, general of the Persian armies, laid siege to the city and demanded their surrender, the Phocians undertook a more radical strategy of defending their city. They abandoned it. Herodotus narrates the event as follows, quote, "The Phocians could not abide the thought of being enslaved, and they requested a single day to debate the matter, after which they would give him their reply. They also asked him to pull his army back from the wall while they were deliberating. Harpagus gave them permission to go ahead with their deliberations, despite the fact that he was, as he told them, well aware of what they intended to do. So, while Harpagus led his army away from the wall, the Phocians launched their pentacounters, put their womenfolk, children, and all their personal effects on board, along with the statues and other dedicatory offerings from their sanctuaries, except those which were made out of bronze or stone or were paintings. Anyway, once everything else was on board, they embarked themselves and sailed to Chios. So the Persians gained control of a Phocaea that was emptied of men." End quote. Thus, the Phocians, like the Trojans of Virgilian myth, who abandoned the embers of a fallen Troy and ventured forth to found Rome, left the empty corpse of their city to the Persians, while carrying with them its living spirit, its customs, and its gods. This is why Herodotus highlights the fact that the Phocians made sure to take along all the statues and dedicatory offerings from their sanctuaries that they could carry. They were, as Kingsley observes, an extremely conservative people, to whom their religion was of the utmost importance. They thus would have seen the preservation of their gods and sacred artifacts as a matter worthy of staking their lives on. Once they arrived in Chios, the Phocians attempted to set up a new home by purchasing some islands in the area, the Onusae, from the native Chians. But the Chians, knowing they were accomplished traders and fearing the economic competition they would bring, refused to sell. The Phocians were thus forced to set sail again. Remembering a colony their people had founded on Cernus 20 years earlier on the advice of an oracle, they decided to set forth for it. But before leaving for Cernus, they first stopped at Phocaea to kill the Persian contingent that had been stationed there. And after they had done this, they called down terrible curses on any of their number who stayed behind and did not take part in the expedition. They then sunk a piece of iron into the sea and vowed that they would not return home until the iron floated. Yet, despite their vows and curses, the yearning for home proved to be too much for most of them. When the time came for them to depart from Chios to Cernus, quote, "Over half of their fellow citizens were so overcome by longing and sorrow for the city and the customs of their native land that they broke their promises and sailed back to Phocaea. The ones who kept their promises, however, set sail for the Onusae." End quote. From there, they sailed to Cernus, reconnected with their people, and established their sanctuaries there. They remained there for 5 years, but made enemies by continually raiding all the local settlements, proving to be enough of a problem that the Tyrrhenians and Carthaginians joined forces to eliminate them. They engaged in combat, and the Phocians won the battle but lost the war, being so crippled by the melee that they could not withstand another engagement, given that they lost 40 of their own ships, and the 20 which survived had bent rams, and so were unfit for active service. So the Phocians were once more forced to gather their women, children, and gods, and set sail. This time they sailed for Rhegium. They were, at this point, likely demoralized and confused. It had seemed they had done everything possible to preserve their culture, yet they continued to meet defeat after defeat. Even Apollo's oracle appeared to have misled them in the past when it had told them to found a colony on Cernus. Yet, amid their doubt and despair, they encountered a wise man from Posidonia who reinterpreted the oracle for them and restored their spirits. He told them that the oracle had not, in fact, directed them to establish a colony on the island of Cernus, but for the hero Cernus. Kingsley observes that both possibilities are conveyed by the very same words in Greek. Quote, Cernus may have been a name for Corsica, but it was also the name of a mythical hero. A hero who had been the son of the greatest hero of all time, Heracles. The on and the for. They're different words in English, but ancient Greek was much more compact. One word in Greek often meant the same as 2 or 3 words in another language. It easily allowed for double meanings, even in everyday talk. End quote. Once the Phocians realized the true meaning of the oracle, they established the city of Elea. This, then, is the story of Elea's founding, and constitutes the true beginning of Eleatic philosophy. It is a story of a daring and heroic people who tried desperately to preserve their traditions and religious practices, and, despite all indications to the contrary, miraculously succeeded. We don't know many of the details of Parmenides' life, but the few we can gather suggest a striking portrait. As far as we can tell, Parmenides was likely among the first children born in Elea after its founding. He was said to be the son of Pyrrhus, and to have been born into a wealthy, noble family. Diogenes Laertius recounts that Parmenides first studied with Xenophanes, known to the ancients as a great castigator and perverter of Homer, on account of his biting critique of poetic religion, and as an opponent of Pythagoras. But Parmenides then rejected Xenophanes and turned instead to the Pythagorean Amanius, a poor man but of noble character, who better conformed to his own nascent philosophical outlook. According to Diogenes, himself citing an account from Sotion, quote, It was this man that he preferred to follow, and when he died he founded a heroic shrine for him, as he was of noble birth and wealth. And it was by Amanius, and not by Xenophanes, that he was guided towards stillness. End quote. Diogenes here identifies 2 crucial aspects of Parmenides' philosophical education that likely seem strange to us today. First, he declares that Parmenides was so affected by Amanius' teaching that he established a heroic shrine to him after he died. This would have been a lavish act. Heroes, in the ancient Greek world, were believed to be men who had shed their mortality and taken up a divine status. Though below the Olympian gods, heroes were nonetheless immortal and possessed noumenal power to help and to harm. For example, the warrior prophet Amphiaraus, one of the 7 against Thebes, was said to have been swallowed alive by the earth during that famous battle. The Thebans, and later the Athenians, subsequently worshipped him as a hero, and he was thought to heal and give oracles to those who slept at his shrine. So, in setting up a hero's shrine for Amanius, Parmenides was attributing a more than human status to his teacher. Indeed, given the nature of hero cults, it is likely that Parmenides would have believed himself to have remained in communication with Amanius after his death. This likely strikes us as bizarre, since we can't conceive of contact with the spirit world as playing any role whatsoever in philosophical education. Indeed, seances and fortune-telling are frequently used as stock examples of bad epistemic practices in introductions to epistemology. Yet, given that such experiences shaped fundamental aspects of Parmenides' philosophical outlook, we must take them seriously if we are to understand his work. Diogenes' second remark is likely just as puzzling to today's audience. He claims it was because Amanius taught him stillness that Parmenides so admired him. Again, this sentiment is alien to the contemporary mind, We praise teachers of philosophy for their dynamic argumentation and sharpness of wit, not for their stillness and silence. Indeed, stillness strikes us more as a religious practice than a philosophical one, as is suggested by even the name hesychism, a tradition of Orthodox Christian mysticism. Yet, for Parmenides, the learning of silence was essential to philosophical education. And so, on account of teaching him silence, he erected for Amanius a heroic shrine. These strange facts suggest that the philosophy practiced by Parmenides, the reputed founder of Western metaphysics, differs radically from the philosophy practiced today. Archaeological discoveries in the 20th century shed further light on Parmenides and his alien philosophy. From 1958 to 1962, in an unusual stroke of good fortune for the study of ancient philosophy, a series of marble inscriptions dating back to the 1st century AD were discovered in the region corresponding to ancient Elea, which provide additional evidence regarding who Parmenides was and the kind of philosophy that he practiced. One of these inscriptions reads, quote, Parmenides, son of Pyres, Uliades, physikos, end quote. Three significant facts stand out in this inscription. First, Kingsley points out that the spelling Parmenides had previously been conjectured to be the original spelling of Parmenides' name. So, finding it here both vindicates that hypothesis and evinces that the inscription preserves an older tradition. This, paired with the extremely conservative nature of Phocian culture, gives us reason to believe that these inscriptions safeguard early information about Parmenides despite their later date. Second, the term Uliades, a term which Kingsley traces back to the Anatolian region of Caria, south of Phocia, means son of Ulias, a name for Apollo that designates his role as a healer. Paradoxically, the adjective Ulias means deadly, but also signifies Apollo's healing power. For example, Strabo records that, quote, both Milesians and Delians invoke an Apollo Ulias, that is, as god of health and healing, for the verb ulein means to be healthy, whence the noun ule and salutation, both health and great joy to thee, for Apollo is the god of healing. End quote. And finally, third, the term physikos can mean inquirer into nature or natural philosopher, since it is used as a common designation for philosophers in the pre-Socratic era. But it also stands at the root of our concepts of the physicist and the physician. According to Kingsley, quote, a physikos was someone who's concerned with the basic principles of existence, who's able to touch the bare bones of what things are, and also use the knowledge that he finds. End quote. For such healers, claims Kingsley, there's no real healing until you come to discover what you are behind the world of the senses. The emphasis on healing becomes even more pronounced in the other inscriptions found at the site. These additional busts were dedicated to other Ulis healers practicing in the lineage of Parmenides. The date of each is identified by the number of years since Parmenides' passing, thus indicating that these healers revered Parmenides as their own founding hero. Just as Parmenides had done for Amanius, so did they for Parmenides. These inscriptions include two additional epithets, pholarkos and iatromantis, that shed additional light on the kind of healing Parmenides practiced. Kingsley explains that the term pholarkos is a combination of folius, a cave, lair, or den where animals hibernate, and archos, lord or chief. The term pholarkos thus means lord of the lair. According to Kingsley, to be or to lie in a lair would thus have meant to enter a state of suspended animation. And in the ancient world, one method of healing in particular employed such states: the method of incubation. Incubation was the practice wherein the sick would trek to holy sites and lay down to sleep therein, so as to enter an altered state of consciousness in the hopes that the deity or hero who resided there would visit them and either heal them directly or instruct them on how to heal. Even the later Neoplatonist philosopher Iamblichus would continue to attest to the widespread practice of incubation. Quote, "In Asclepius's sanctuaries, diseases are arrested by divine dreams, and, because of the structure of nocturnal apparitions, the medical art has arisen from sacred dreams." End quote. In the ancient world, the entities people encountered through incubation were not taken to be merely subjective dream figures, but were considered to be objectively real. For example, when describing incubation, the poet Pindar relates the appearance of what in today's spiritualism would be called an apport, a physical materialization of an object. He relates the story of Bellerophon and how he went to sleep at Athena's shrine, met with her, and upon waking found a golden bridle she had left for him. He recounts this episode in the 13th Olympian Ode as follows, quote, "Bellerophon once suffered much indeed in his yearning to yoke Pegasus, the snaky Gorgon's son, beside the spring, until, that is, the maiden Pallas brought him the bridle with the golden bands, when his dream suddenly became reality and she spoke. 'Are you asleep, prince of Aeolus's race? Come, take this horse charm, and, sacrificing a white bull, show it to your father, the horse tamer.' So much did the maiden of the dark ages seem to say to him as he slept in the darkness, and he leapt to his feet. He took the marvel that lay beside him, and gladly sought out the local seer, the son of Koiranos, to whom he revealed the entire outcome of the affair, how he slept the night on the goddess's altar at the bidding of the seer's oracle, and how the very daughter of Zeus, whose spear is the thunderbolt, gave him the spirit-taming gold. The seer commanded him to heed the dream as quickly as possible, and, upon sacrificing a strong-footed victim to the mighty earth-holder, to erect at once an altar to Athena Hippia. The god's power easily brings into being even what one would swear is impossible and beyond hope." End quote. In this story of incubation, Pindar declares that the dream world becomes reality. Athena literally appears before Bellerophon, speaks audible words to him, and leaves a golden bridle for him as a physical gift. And, as was the case in incubatory practices, Bellerophon then goes to a seer to help him understand his experience. Iamblichus similarly attests to the reality of such encounters when he distinguishes divine or God-sent dreams from ordinary ones. Such divine dreams do not occur in the standard way. Quote, "On the contrary, even when sleep departs, just as we are awakening, it is possible to hear a sudden voice guiding us about things to be done, or the voices are heard between waking and going to sleep, or even when wholly awake. And sometimes an intangible and incorporeal spirit encircles those lying down, so that there is no visual perception of it, but some other awareness and self-consciousness. When entering, it makes a whooshing sound and diffuses itself in all directions without any contact. And it does wondrous works by way of freeing both soul and body from their sufferings. At other times, however, when a light shines brightly and peacefully, not only is the sight of the eye possessed, but closed up after previously being quite open. And the other senses are awake and consciously aware of how the gods shine forth in the light, and with a clear understanding they both hear what they say and know what they do. This is observed even more fully when the sight is active, and also the mind, with full vigor, understands the things done, and there is a response at the same time in those observing. These dreams, then, being numerous and quite different, do not resemble anything human, but dream sleep and possession of the eyes, a seizure similar to a blackout, a state between sleep and wakefulness, and presently a stirring or complete wakefulness, All of these are divine and fit for reception of the gods, and they are sent by the gods themselves. And such things precede it, a part of the divine epiphany." End quote. Here, Iamblichus describes encounters with the gods that occur not only in dreams, but also in altered states of consciousness, between sleep and wakefulness, and even when wholly awake. Sometimes these entities are perceived with a subtle sense, but other times they are encountered sensibly. They make a whooshing, piping, or hissing sound upon entering, and have direct healing effects on the mind and body. The eyes behold a bright light, and the senses perceive how entities shine forth in that light and can discern what they speak and what they do. And these interactions can occur, claims Iamblichus, when the mind is in a state of full vigor and complete wakefulness. Likewise, Aristides, a man who sought healing through incubation at Asclepius's Epidaurian temple, provides a similar testimony concerning the reality of these encounters. Aristides, speaking of how he was provided with a remedy for his illness, attests, quote, "It was revealed in the clearest way possible, just as countless other things also made the presence of the god manifest. For I seemed almost to touch him, and to perceive that he himself was coming, and to be halfway between sleep and waking, and to want to get the power of vision, and to be anxious lest he depart beforehand, and to have turned my ears to listen, sometimes as in a dream, sometimes as in a waking vision. And my hair was standing on end, and tears of joy came forth, and the weight of knowledge was no burden. What man could even set these things forth in words? But if he is one of the initiates, then he knows and understands." End quote. Again, Aristides reports a real encounter with a spiritual intelligence, not a mere dream. The presence of the god is manifest in the clearest way possible. The encounter is tactual, as he almost touches the god and his hairs stand on end. And it occurs not in sleep, but in a state halfway between sleep and waking, and even, at times, in a waking vision. These sorts of cases provide ample evidence for the fact that the people who engaged in incubation believed themselves to be in contact with intelligent, non-human entities who were capable of communicating with and healing them. One skill is essential to the practice of incubation: stillness. The skill Parmenides learned from his teacher Amanius the Pythagorean. According to Kingsley, quote, "What's important is that you would do absolutely nothing. The point came when you wouldn't struggle or make an effort. You just have to surrender to your condition. You would lie down as if you were dead, wait without eating or moving, sometimes for days at a time, and you'd wait for healing to come from somewhere else, from another level of awareness and another level of being." End quote. This brings us to the term pholarkos. A pholarkos, or lord of the lair, is one who would oversee this process. Strabo describes some of the activities of these lords of the lair when talking about the Charonium, or entrance to the underworld, in Caria, an Anatolian region south of Phocia. Strabo explains, quote, "On the road between the Tralles and Nyssa is a village of the Nysians, not far from the city Acharica, where is the Plutonium, with a costly sacred precinct and a shrine to Pluto and Cora, and also a Charonium, a cave that lies above the sacred precinct, by nature wonderful. For they say that those who are diseased and give heed to the cures prescribed by these gods resort thither, and live in the village near the cave among the experienced priests, who on their behalf sleep in the cave and through dreams prescribe cures. These are also the men who invoke the healing power of the gods, and they often bring the sick into the cave and leave them there to remain in stillness, like animals in their lurking holes, without food for many days. And sometimes the sick give heed also to their own dreams, but still they use those other men, as priests to initiate them into the mysteries and to counsel them. To all others, the place is forbidden and deadly." End quote. The lords of the lair are thus vital to the process of incubation. Without them, the holy site would remain forbidden and deadly. Strabo depicts these priests as ministering in several ways. Sometimes they themselves sleep in the cave so as to converse with entities who can then prescribe cures for the sick or channel their healing powers through the priests. Other times, they bring the sick into the cave and supervise them as they lie without food or water for several days, hoping for a personal encounter with the entities. If they succeed in making contact, the priests will then counsel them and help them interpret their experience. The term pholarkos thus indicates that healers working in the lineage of Parmenides, in order to teach and to heal, routinely employed non-ordinary states of consciousness and claimed to connect with strange beings normally invisible to us. The second major title contained in the inscriptions at Elea, iatromantis, has similar implications. The term iatromantis is derived from iatros, meaning healer, and mantis, meaning prophet, and so means healing prophet. According to Kingsley, these healing prophets healed specifically through their prophecy, their ability to contact and then talk from another level of consciousness. In ancient Greek culture, quote, "Prophecy was what came first, the ability to look behind the scenes, see what others don't. The healing followed as a matter of course." End quote. In short, an iatromantis is what today would be called a shamanic healer. A shaman, according to Eliade's classical definition, is a great master of ecstasy. Shamans have mastered the techniques of ecstasy, techniques which allow them to enter expanded states of awareness. In these states, they perceive and act within a different world than the one confronting ordinary consciousness. And in that other world, they make contact with beings normally invisible to the naked eye. Shamans then use the power conferred by these beings to heal their people. Eliade explains shamans are, quote, "separated from the rest of the community by the intensity of their own religious experience. In other words, it would be more correct to class shamanism among the mysticisms than with what is commonly called a religion. In contrast to the state of affairs in Christianity, people who profess to be shamanists accord considerable importance to the ecstatic experiences of their shamans. These experiences concern them personally and immediately, for it is the shamans who, by their trances, cure them, accompany their dead to the realm of the shades, and serve as mediators between them and their gods, celestial or infernal, greater or lesser. This small mystical elite not only directs the community's religious life, but, as it were, guards its soul. The shaman is the great specialist in the human soul. He alone sees it, for he knows its form and destiny." End quote. The term iatromantis thus places Parmenides and those who followed him in the company of other Greek shamanic figures, such as Abaris the Hyperborean, Aristeas, Hermotimus of Clazomenae, Epimenides of Crete, Pythagoras, and Empedocles, all of whom performed miraculous feats in virtue of their connection to an invisible realm. In this manner, 20th century discoveries reveal Parmenides as an Uliades, a son of Apollo, a Pholarkos, a lord of the lair and master of the process of incubation, and an iatromantis, a shamanic healer priest. All of these terms are interconnected in that they imply a form of consciousness that differs from ordinary consciousness and presents a world distinct from the ordinary world. Anthropologist Michael Harner has called this different form of consciousness the shamanic state of consciousness, and distinguished it from the ordinary state of consciousness. Each of these states reveals a corresponding world. The ordinary world, or what Carlos Castaneda termed ordinary reality for the ordinary state of consciousness, and the non-ordinary world, or non-ordinary reality, for the shamanic state of consciousness. Hartner explains, quote, "Fantasy can be said to be a term applied by a person in the ordinary state of consciousness to what is experienced in the shamanic state of consciousness. Conversely, a person in the shamanic state of consciousness may perceive the experiences of the ordinary state of consciousness to be illusory in shamanic state of consciousness terms. Both are right as viewed from their own particular states of consciousness. The myth of the shamanic state of consciousness is ordinary reality. The myth of the ordinary state of consciousness is non-ordinary reality." End quote. Understanding this historical context of Parmenides' life and thought will allow us to apprehend core components of his philosophy that otherwise remain elusive. Parmenides is said to have written a single philosophical work, which has come to be called On Nature, though this title is almost surely a later invention. This work was not composed in prose, but in hexameter verse, the language of Homer, Hesiod, and the Delphic oracle. Parmenides thus delivered his philosophy as an oracular poem, rather than as the kind of treatise we are used to today. Unfortunately, as with the works of other pre-Socratic philosophers, the extant fragments of this poem have been preserved only in quotations from later authors. The poem itself is traditionally divided into three sections. First, a proem, which describes Parmenides' journey to meet an unnamed goddess. Second, a section in which this goddess discloses to Parmenides the unshakable heart of truth. And third, a section in which she recounts the opinions of mortals, in whom there is no true faith. The first two sections are better preserved than the third, the contents of which must largely be pieced together from summaries of later authors, rather than from direct quotations. Let's examine each of these sections in turn. Parmenides begins with a proem, wherein he recounts his journey through the sky to the house of an unnamed goddess, who greets him kindly and gives him a message to convey to the world. It goes as follows, quote, "The mares that carry me as far as spirit might reach were bringing me onward, after having led me and set me down on the Daimon's many-worded road, which carries through all towns the man who knows. It was on this road that I was being carried, for on it the much-knowing horses were carrying me, straining at the chariot, and maidens were leading the way. The axle blazing in the naves let loose the loud, far-reaching call of a flute, for it was being driven on by two whirling wheels, one on each side, when the maidens of the sun hastened to escort me, after they had left behind the palace of night, towards the light, and had thrust the veils away from their heads with their hands. That is where the gate of the paths of night and day is, and a lintel and a stone threshold hold it on both sides. Itself ethereal, it is occupied by great doors, and much punishing justice holds its alternating keys. The maidens, speaking gently to her with mild words, wisely persuaded her to thrust quickly back for them the bolted bar from the gate. And when it flew open, it made a gaping chasm of the doors, after rotating in turn in their pipes the two bronze pivots fastened with pegs and rivets. There, through them, the maidens guided the chariot and horses straight along the way, and the goddess received me graciously, grasped my right hand in her own hand, and uttered an oracle, addressing me in this manner. O Kouros, consort of deathless charioteers, you who have come to our home by the mares that carry you, rejoice, for it is no wise an evil fate that has sent you forth to travel this road. For indeed it is far from mortal men and beyond the trodden path, but right and justice. It is necessary that you learn everything, both the untrembling heart of well-convincing truth, and the opinions of mortal men, in which there is no true faith. But nonetheless you will learn these things too, how it is needful for opinings to be acceptable, penetrating all through all." End quote. In its broadest outline, Parmenides' proem depicts a journey in which the author, described as a kouros, or young man, is carried in an otherworldly chariot that blazes brightly and emits a strange piping sound. This chariot is drawn on by horses that are full of knowledge, and the Heliades, the daughters of the sun, serve as its charioteers and his intimate companions. They carry him onward till they reach the gate to the house of night and day, which is guarded by justice. The Heliades entreat her, and she opens the doors for them upon their request. They then escort the kouros across the threshold and into the house. There, he is greeted kindly by the mistress of the house, an unnamed goddess, and she tells him that he must learn both the unshakable heart of truth and the opinions of mortals, in whom there is no true faith. The images in the proem are evocative in their own right, but they become even more meaningful when we understand the mythological landscape to which Parmenides alludes. For Parmenides evokes a common mythological universe that would have been familiar to his audience. To begin with, Parmenides' description of his destination, the house of night and day, would have called to mind Hesiod's description of the underworld. According to Hesiod, Tartarus stands below the roots of the earth and of the barren sea, and, like the Parmenidean house of night and day, which lies far from the trodden paths of men, it lies at the farthest part of huge earth. And, like the pivots in the gates of the house, the gates of Tartarus are made of bronze. Hesiod continues, quote, "That is where the sources and limits of the dark earth are, and of murky Tartarus, and the barren sea, and of the starry sky, of everything, one after another, distressful, dank, things which even the gods hate. A great chasm, whose bottom one would not reach in a whole long year, once one was inside the gates, but one would be borne hither and thither by one distressful blast after another. It is terrible for the immortal gods as well, this monstrosity. And the terrible houses of dark night stand there, shrouded in black clouds." End quote. This depiction of the underworld as holding the sources and limits of earth and starry sky calls to mind Parmenides' description of the gate to the house of day and night, which has a stone threshold, but is itself ethereal. And Hesiod's description of the chasm that would confront one upon passing through the gates echoes Parmenides' description of the gaping chasm that was created as the doors to the house flew open. Hesiod likewise here locates the houses of night towards which Parmenides travels in his proem. Hesiod elaborates, quote, "In front of these, Iapetus' son holds the broad sky with his head and tireless hands, standing immovable, where night and day passing greet one another as they cross the great bronze threshold. The one is about to go in and the other is going out the door. And never does the house hold them both inside, but always the one goes out from the house and passes over the earth, while the other, in turn remaining inside the house, waits for the time of her own departure until it comes. The one holds much seeing light for those on earth, but the other holds sleep in her hands, the brother of death, deadly night, shrouded in murky cloud." End quote. Here, Hesiod describes the same gate of the paths of night and day mentioned by Parmenides, and he also describes day and night's alternating sequence of departure and arrival, just as Parmenides depicts justice, the keeper of the gates, as holding its alternating keys. And Hesiod was not the only ancient author who articulated such a description of the underworld. Laura Steele, for example, drawing on the work of Wolfgang Hempel, has shown how the world of Parmenides' proem also mirrors elements from Babylonian mythology. According to this mythology, the sun god Shamash would retire to his house in the underworld every evening, a house guarded by bolted doors, which was watched over by justice. For example, Steele cites a passage in a Babylonian sunset prayer which reads as follows, quote, "O Shamash, when you enter heaven's interior, may the pure bolt of heaven greet you. May the door of heaven salute you. May justice, your beloved vizier, bring you straight in." End quote. The identification of justice as the gatekeeper of the house is likely grounded in the diurnal alternation between light and darkness, since justice is equated with cosmic order, and one of the most primordial ways we experience that order is through the regular sequence in which day follows night and night follows day. The poetic tradition of Homer and Hesiod similarly includes justice, along with her sisters lawfulness and peace, as one of the horai, or the seasons, and declares that together these guard the gates of heaven and Olympus. Associations with the lower world are further emphasized by the language of initiation running throughout the proem. The terms kouros and the man who knows were technical terms used in mystery religions to describe those initiated into their rites. Kingsley, for example, notes that the term kouros, quote, was closely connected with initiation. The kouros stands at the borderline between the world of the human and the world of the divine, has access to them both, and is loved and recognized by them both. End quote. The kouros connects to this divine world by undertaking a journey wherein, if he is successful, he will establish a relation with a guardian spirit. Kingsley explains, quote, "That other world is the world of the gods, where the kouros finds a source of nourishment and guidance that nothing in the ordinary world of humans can ever give him. Where, if he is lucky, divinely protected, he can encounter the divinity who will become his immortal parent and teacher and guide." End quote. Likewise, the facts, 1. That the kouros' path is identified with the path of the daimon. 2. That the Heliades utter secret words to allow the kouros to pass the threshold. 3. That the goddess is unnamed. And 4. That she assures Parmenides that no evil fate has sent him, all would have been associated with mystery rites in the ancient world. A common theme in such rites was, once more, the undertaking of a journey, while alive, to the realm of the dead, to secure a better afterlife. According to historian of religion Walter Burkert, quote, "The mysteries, taking from death its terror, are the guarantee of a better fate in the afterworld." End quote. We see this, for example, in Euripides' depiction of Heracles as successfully carrying off Cerberus on account of having been initiated into the Eleusinian mysteries. Heracles, in this work, declares that he bested Cerberus, quote, "in a fight, for I had been fortunate enough to witness the secret rites of the initiated." End quote. Similarly, the Homeric hymn to Demeter declares, quote, "Demeter revealed her sacred rites to the kings who give justice, teaching her mysteries to them all. Sacred things not to be transgressed, asked about or uttered. Great awe of the gods stops the voice. Blessed are earthbound mortals who have seen these rites, but the uninitiate, who has no share in them, never has the same lot when dead in misty darkness." End quote. Pindar, likewise, espouses this view of the Eleusinian mysteries in a fragment preserved by Clement of Alexandria. In it, Pindar declares, quote, "Blessed is he who sees them and goes beneath the earth. He knows the end of life and knows its Zeus-given beginning." End quote. And in the same manner, Sophocles proclaims, quote, "Thrice blessed are those mortals who have seen these rites and thus enter into Hades. For them alone there is life, for the others all is misery." End quote. In addition to its associations with the underworld and initiations, the imagery of Parmenides' proem would have called to mind a very particular myth for its original audience, the myth of Phaethon. According to this myth, Phaethon was a young man of divine parentage, the son of the sun god Helios, and, depending on the version of the story, either a mortal woman or a nymph. One day, Phaethon goes to visit a supposed friend who calls his paternity into question and accuses his mother of deception. Shaken, Phaethon returns home and asks his mother for proof of his divine ancestry. His mother, outraged at the insult from Phaethon's erstwhile friend, swears that Helios is indeed his father, and encourages him to go to him and ask for proof of his legitimate sonship. Phaethon then makes the journey to the house of the sun and is greeted kindly by his father. He asks his father for some proof of his divine paternity, so as to stop the mouths of gossips. Helios accedes to his son's request, and swears by the river Styx that Phaethon shall have as proof anything he desires. Fatefully, Phaethon desires to ride his father's chariot, the chariot of the sun. Upon hearing this request, Helios immediately repents of his offer. Yet he cannot renege on his promise, since he is sworn by the river Styx. He thus attempts to dissuade his son from undertaking this perilous journey, warning him of the many dangers involved and of how no one besides himself, not even Zeus, is capable of steering his unruly horses through their hazardous course, and exclaiming, quote, "What you desire is most dangerous. You seek a gift that is too great for you, beyond your strength, beyond your boyish years. Your fate is mortal. What you ask for isn't." End quote. Unrelenting, Phaethon mounts his father's chariot and begins to carry the sun up through its diurnal path. Yet he is soon overwhelmed and loses control of the horses, scorching earth and heaven in the process. In order to prevent the earth from being incinerated, Zeus strikes Phaethon dead with a thunderbolt, which hurls him to the earth, where he falls into the river Eridanus. His sisters, the Heliades, come there to mourn him, and they remain so long they transform into poplar trees, their tears turning to amber. The parallels to Parmenides' proem are striking. Parmenides, like Phaethon, mounts a chariot through the heavens which carries him all the way back to the house of the sun, behind the gates of day and night. Like the chariot of the sun, Parmenides' chariot blazes brightly, and the road of the daimon that Parmenides follows was a name for the sun's path through the sky. And finally, the Heliades feature prominently in both tales. Yet the contrasts between these two stories are also evident and indicate what Parmenides wants to uniquely emphasize in his work. While Phaethon's desires lead to destruction, Parmenides' desires lead to eternal life. He travels as far as his thumos, his spirit or desire, can reach, and is welcomed kindly by the goddess who opens his eyes to eternal being. While Phaethon is unsure of his parentage, ignorant of how to steer his father's chariot, and oblivious to the dangers posed by his actions despite his father's clear warnings, Parmenides is one who knows. While Phaethon dares greatly and fails, Parmenides dares greatly and succeeds. While Phaethon falls dead to the earth, Parmenides crosses into the underworld while alive. While Phaethon is welcomed by and speaks with the sun god his father and fails to heed his warnings, Parmenides is welcomed by and speaks with an unnamed goddess and presumably accepts her revelations, given that he has delivered them to us. And while the Heliades mourn for their lost brother Phaethon along the Eridanus River, they happily guide Parmenides to the house of the gates of day and night and escort him inside. In short, whereas the story of Phaethon is a warning against human hubris and the attempt to encroach on the domain of the gods, Parmenides' story is a proclamation of good news. A story of what happens when man's yearning for the divine is preceded by grace and drawn back to its source. Furthermore, Parmenides' depiction of his close relation with the Heliades, a relation described by the word suniaros, meaning companion or consort, and his gracious reception by the goddess would likely have brought to mind Hesiod's story of Phaethon, narrated in the Theogony. According to Hesiod's tale, Phaethon was the son of the goddess Eos and Cephalus. Quote, "To Cephalus she bore a splendid son, powerful Phaethon, a man equal to the gods. While he was young, a delicate, spirited child, and still possessed the tender flower of glorious youth, smile-loving Aphrodite snatched him away and made him her innermost temple keeper in her holy temples, a divine spirit." End quote. Here the theme of divinization hinted at in Parmenides' proem is stated explicitly. Phaethon is a man equal to the gods. And like Parmenides, who is described as a kouros, or a young man, Phaethon is described as a young, delicate, spirited child, still possessing the tender flower of glorious youth. And the theme of abduction is portrayed clearly in both tales. Parmenides takes pains to emphasize that he is carried to his destination, using the verb to carry 4 times within the first 4 lines of the poem, and he stresses that he is led by the Heliades, presumably sent by the goddess to fetch him and bring him into her inner sanctum. And this theme of abduction is also central to Hesiod's account of Phaethon. It constitutes the backdrop to the story, since in other versions of the myth, Phaethon's father, Cephalus, was himself snatched away by Phaethon's mother, the goddess Eos. And it is also the main theme of the story, a story in which Aphrodite carries Phaethon away to serve as her temple keeper and makes him a divine spirit. The proem's central themes, the journey to the underworld, the initiation into the mysteries, and the portrayal of a successful Phaethon, when paired with the historical background of Greek shamanism set forth earlier, open the path to a new interpretation of Parmenides' great work. Allegorical interpretations have been dominant since the days of Sextus Empiricus, who identified the mares that carry the kouros with impulses and irrational desires of the soul, the maidens with sensations, and the 2 whirling wheels with the ears, hinting allegorically at hearing. Such allegorical interpretations construe the journey depicted in the proem as a metaphor for the mind's turning away from sensation, or what Sellers would later call the manifest image, and towards an abstract use of the understanding, or what Sellers would later call the scientific image. Yet, the fact that Parmenides was a practicing shaman who had mastered stillness not only allows for, but renders likely, another possibility. Parmenides was describing a literal journey into non-ordinary reality, and his interactions with the entities who reside there. Recall the details of Parmenides' journey. To begin with, he is carried up into the sky, or abducted, by the Heliades, who are nymphs and daughters of the sun. To the Greek mind, nymphs were, like creatures of fairy lore from other cultures, non-human intelligences. They were thought to be nature spirits, who are normally invisible, but nonetheless capable of appearing and interacting with humans in a physical form. And the fact that the particular nymphs with whom Parmenides interacts are the daughters of the sun suggests that they are luminous. Furthermore, Parmenides is carried through the sky in some kind of craft, the chariot of the sun. The image of the sun itself suggests that this vehicle would have resembled a glowing orb. Yet the chariot of the sun is also depicted throughout Greek mythology as having a distinctive shape, that of a golden bowl. For example, in Aeschylus's lost tragedy concerning the Heliades, someone laments for Phaethon, quote, "Where, in the west, is the bowl wrought by Hephaestus, the bowl of thy sire? Speeding wherein he crosseth the mighty, swelling stream that girdleth the earth, fleeing the gloom of holy night of sable steeds." End quote. And classicist Herbert Weyer-Smith points out that this depiction of the sun's chariot as a bowl was common, not just in ancient Greece, but also in the broader Indo-European tradition. He elaborates, quote, "To explain the rising of the sun in the east after it had set in the west, Greek fancy invented the myth that the sun god possessed a golden bowl, in which he, together with his steeds, was carried during the night across the ocean to the place of his rising. When Heracles was journeying to Erythea to capture the oxen of Geryon, Helios lent his bowl to the hero. In the Veda and in Germanic and Lettic myths, the sun appears in the form of a golden bowl." End quote. And Parmenides provides some additional details about this craft. He notes that it glows and emits a strange hissing or piping sound, since it is driven on by two whirling wheels, and is pulled by much-knowing horses, who can take one as far as one might desire without needing to be prompted. The path through the sky taken by this craft is identified with the path of the daimon and the paths of night and day, and is said to belong to the man who knows. This path leads to another world, a world usually invisible to us. Upon reaching his destination, he is confronted by an imposing being, a guardian of the threshold, who allows him to pass only after the Heliades speak to her to vouchsafe his entry. In the crossing of the threshold, there is once more the suggestion of a strange sound, when the sockets in the doors are described as pipes. Parmenides here uses the same word he used to describe the strange sound emitted by the chariot of the sun. Once he passes the threshold and is escorted into the house, Parmenides is confronted by yet another entity. She is apparently the leader of the others, and was responsible for bringing him there. She greets him warmly and informs him that he was summoned to her home, far from the trodden paths of mortal men, so that she could teach him something important. She then proceeds to instruct him both about the nature of fundamental reality and about the opinions of mortal men. When spelled out in this manner, it becomes clear that Parmenides' account parallels those of others who claim to have made contact with another world. For example, the description of a path through the sky upon which the man who knows travels mirrors similar concepts in ancient Indian thought. Jacques Vallée, for example, points out that an ancient Indian astronomical text maintains that, quote, "Below the moon and above the clouds revolve the siddhas and the vidyaharas," end quote. And he observes how, quote, "Indian tradition holds that the siddhas could become very heavy at will, or as light as a feather, travel through space and disappear from sight," end quote. Or again, Parmenides' account of the much-knowing horses, gleaming chariot, and whirling wheels calls to mind the Old Testament story of the prophet Ezekiel's vision of God at the Kebar River, where he encounters living creatures and wheels within wheels. The prophet declares, quote, "And now I looked at the living creatures, and I saw a wheel on the earth beside the living creatures, one for each of the four of them. As for the appearance of the wheels and their construction, their appearance was like the gleaming of beryl, and the four had the same likeness, their appearance and construction, as it were, a wheel within a wheel. When they went in any of the four directions without turning as they went. And their rims were tall and awesome, and the rims of all four were full of eyes all around. And when the living creatures went, the wheels went beside them. And when the living creatures rose from the earth, the wheels rose. Wherever the spirit wanted to go, they went, and the wheels rose along with them, for the spirit of the living creatures was in the wheels." End quote. And the parallels continue even into the contemporary world. Consider, for example, the experiences of those who report having been abducted by aliens. Psychiatrist John Mack observes that, in such cases, there is often a humming or vibratory sensation at the onset of the experience, and that, quote, "The first indication that an abduction is about to occur might be an unexplained intense blue or white light that floods the bedroom, an odd buzzing or humming sound, or even the direct sighting of one or more humanoid beings in the room. And, of course, the close-up sighting of a strange craft." End quote. Here, again, we have the same features enumerated in Parmenides' account. A blazing light, a strange piping sound, an encounter with humanoid nymphs and various other non-human entities, and a strange craft that flies through the sky. It is worth noting the details of some of the particular testimonies recorded by Mack to show how closely they correspond to Parmenides' account. One person, going under the name Jerry, claims to have, quote, had a number of nightmares in which she would awaken paralyzed, hear buzzing and ringing and whirring noises in her head, and see humanoid beings in her room, end quote. Another experiencer, going under the name Will, recounts a more detailed story involving humming, lights, flying through the air, crossing a threshold, and an interaction with a luminous being. Quote, Will told us of a dramatic encounter that had occurred in 1980, when he and his wife were sailing from Bermuda to New England. He was awakened at about 3 a.m. by a kind of humming sound that he had never heard before. He came up the companionway ladder, he said, and off the starboard side of the boat, he saw a city of lights. The thing looked huge and was pretty well defined. It had multiple levels and lights around it, appearing as if the lights are coming from inside, if that's possible. He noted that the huge object was not in nor on the water, so it's somehow above the water, and I'm saying that it doesn't make sense. Then, Will said, the light changes. There is a different pitch to it. The frequency changes. The vibration actually. I can begin to feel the vibration now, somehow in my body. He was upset as he recalled what followed. I can feel the tracks of tears on my face. They're very, very cool. All of a sudden, I'm in the air. I'm not really inside a tunnel, but that would be one way of describing it. There's a differentiation between this column that's around me and surrounding space. He felt around him a complete immersion in diffuse light, and there's a vibration that I'm aware of. It's completely familiar now. I'm just in a rush to get from here to there. All of a sudden, I know I'm passing through, literally, a threshold. Then I'm there. I'm inside. Someone recognizes me. Inside the craft, Will felt that he was somehow different, no longer the guy that left the sailboat. Around him were tall figures, perhaps 7 or 8 feet in height, that appeared to be translucent. There's a beauty that doesn't make any sense, he was crying now. I don't know why they're beautiful, because they don't look like they're beautiful. They have a bluish tint. I guess there are extremities, but I don't see well-defined arms and limbs. When he looked into the beings, all he could see was light, or light structures. Luminous is a better word than translucent. End quote. Or again, consider the testimony of someone going under the name Andrea, which again involves a humming sound, light, the crossing of a threshold, and an encounter with luminous beings. Quote, Andrea attributes to the light itself the energy to float her out of the house up to a spaceship. She was awakened by a humming sound that seemed to surround the house, and a flash of bright blue light, like a big headlight of a car. She felt afraid, but found that she could not move, and her whole body began to vibrate. She recalled seeing 2 small thin beings with huge heads, large eyes, and long arms and legs, one of whom was holding a stick or rod that he pressed on the back of her ear. They're very skinny, she remembered, and they look like they're made of light. But then, underneath, there's some physicalness to them, like bones. They're not bones, though. One of the beings made strong eye contact with her. His eyes are on my eyes. And this seemed somehow to get her up out of bed. After this, Andrea recalled that she floated feet first, right through the glass window, which was just amazing to me. Then she floated, still feet first, high over the trees and could see the road below, which seemed to be illuminated by the same light. The floating power was in the light, she said. It seemed to form a line or thread that extended from her navel to the beings. It also seemed as if streamers of light were coming out from one of the beings to her body. These threads of light seemed to be used to pull her up to the ship. This light, or energy, seemed to Andrea to bring about changes in her body. I'm not a body anymore, she recalled as she passed through the glass. My body is expanding completely into the glass. The cells completely explode and expand. And that's how I go through the window, because the glass is just nothing. The glass is just like light going through light. I'm light, she recalled. My whole body, they similarly turn my body to light. End quote. In addition to these parallels, the beings these people encounter are, like Parmenides' unnamed goddess, intent on instruction, teaching them both about ultimate reality and earthly life. A woman by the name of Sarah, for example, identifies an alien being as her first real teacher, and attributes her passion for philosophy and spirituality to her lifelong encounters with alien beings. And it is interesting to note that, like Parmenides' teacher, these alien instructors are frequently female. For example, a man going by the name of Peter describes one female entity that was to be his teacher, characterizing her as his guardian and someone who is to watch for him. Likewise, a man going by the name of Ed chronicles his own experience with a female instructor. He recounts that, quote, "Her attitude was, 'Now we'll get down to business, like a teacher. You might settle your students by first telling them a light story when they first come in the classroom. Just get them settled, focused, and then kind of lead them into, and then she started explaining things to me.'" End quote. Like the goddess who welcomes Parmenides, this entity first makes sure that her student is settled before going on to actually deliver her instruction. And, in another interesting parallel, this entity is said to be accompanied by others that serve her as her supporting staff, just as the Heliades appear to be carrying out the bidding of Parmenides' unnamed goddess. And these parallels hold not only in the manner of teaching, but also in the content taught. Just as Parmenides' goddess sets out to expand the unity of being in the unshakable heart of well-convincing truth, so too did these beings pronounce a cosmic unity. Mack explains their doctrine as follows, quote, "The alien beings that abductees speak about seem to many of them to come from another domain that is felt to be closer to the source of being or primary creation. They have been described, however homely their appearance, as intermediaries or emissaries from God, even as angels. The acknowledgement of their existence, after the initial ontological shock, is sometimes the first step in the opening of consciousness to a universe that is no longer simply material. Abductees come to appreciate that the universe is filled with intelligence, and is itself intelligent. They develop a sense of awe before a mysterious cosmos that becomes sacred and ensouled. The sense of separation from all the rest of creation breaks down, and the experience of oneness becomes an essential aspect of the evolution of the abductee's consciousness." End quote. Or again, they, quote, "experience a kind of ecstasy which can reach orgasmic proportions, as they feel themselves open through their experiences to a divine source or creative center of being in the cosmos. This source is, to abductees, inexpressibly luminous and filled with color, and they may weep when they find themselves in its presence, for separation from it was painful beyond words. As their experiences are brought into full consciousness, some abductees come to feel increasingly a sense of oneness with all beings and all creation." End quote. Here Mack describes an experience of unity similar to the doctrines explicated by the goddess in the Way of Truth. And the contention that the universe is itself intelligent mirrors the goddess's famous contention that it is the same, to think and also to be. And the parallels extend not only to the goddess's way of truth, but also to her way of opinion. Consider again the testimony of the man called Ed, concerning the teaching of the female being that he encountered. He says that, quote, "She explained things in scientific, logical terms, elucidating a series of interrelated concepts, that these are the laws of the universe, specifying in detail these concepts." End quote. After setting forth the laws of the cosmos, she then judges human society by those laws, demonstrating how we are on a self-destructive path. She informs him about, quote, the way humans are conducting themselves here in terms of international politics, our environment, our violence to each other, our food, and all that. And she kept on explaining the laws of the universe are this way. And it's like, if you're driving on the wrong side of the road, what's going to happen inevitably, you know? It's like, here are the laws, and here's the way you humans conduct your affairs, and slam, bang, you know it's inevitable. End quote. Like Parmenides' goddess, these entities not only teach about the unity at the heart of reality, but also explain the laws governing the cosmos, and how human society falls under those laws. The doctrines these beings deliver thus mirrors the teaching in both the way of truth and the way of opinion. From such parallels, we can conclude that Parmenidean philosophy relates not only to ancient shamanism, but also to the contemporary phenomenon of alien abduction. And these correspondences to both past and present encounters with extraordinary reality support the possibility of a literal interpretation of the proem. On such an interpretation, Parmenides really did journey to another realm and interact with non-human intelligences, who conveyed to him a message to deliver. Adopting a literal reading of the proem will allow us to articulate a novel interpretation of the arguments in the rest of Parmenides' work. We shall begin with the way of truth, and then continue to the way of opinion. The goddess begins the way of truth as follows, quote, come now. As for me, I shall speak, and as for you, carry away my tale when you have heard it, so as to preserve it. What are the only roads of investigation for thinking? The one, it is, and it is not possible that it is not, is the path of persuasion, for it accompanies truth, and the other, that it is not, and it is necessary that it is not. Truly, I show you this to be a path wholly without tidings. For you could not know that which is not, for this cannot be accomplished, nor could you point it out. For it is the very same, to think and also to be. End quote. This passage begins with Parmenides' prophetic commission. It is the goddess who shall speak, and Parmenides is commanded to carry her words into the mortal world. In light of Parmenides' shamanic background, we can, once more, take this account literally. We need not read this section as some kind of grand rhetorical scheme on Parmenides' part to lend added weight to his arguments. Rather, Parmenides is simply reporting on what he actually experienced. Indeed, the sort of encounter described by Parmenides is again not unique, but a familiar occurrence in prophetic literature. Consider again the case of the Old Testament prophet Ezekiel. He recounts his calling as follows, quote, and he said to me, Son of man, stand on your feet, and I will speak with you. And as he spoke to me, the Spirit entered into me and set me on my feet, and I heard him speaking to me. And he said to me, Son of man, I send you to the people of Israel, to a nation of rebels, who have rebelled against me. They and their fathers have transgressed against me to this very day. The descendants also are impudent and stubborn. I send you to them, and you shall say to them, Thus says the Lord God, and whether they hear or refuse to hear, for they are a rebellious house, they will know that a prophet has been among them. And you, Son of man, be not afraid of them, nor be afraid of their words, though briars and thorns are with you, and you sit on scorpions. Be not afraid of their words, nor be dismayed at their looks, for they are a rebellious house. And you shall speak my words to them, whether they hear or refuse to hear, for they are a rebellious house. End quote. In this passage, Ezekiel, like Parmenides, is confronted by a divinity and given a message to deliver to his people. He is sent to them to say, Thus says the Lord God, and through his words, whether heeded or not, the people will know that a prophet has been among them. Parmenides has been given a similar charge by the goddess, as he is called to carry her words of being to an ignorant people. In it, she distinguishes between two seemingly mutually exclusive and jointly exhaustive roads by which thinking can seek satisfaction. She identifies the first road with 1. Necessary existence. It is, and it is not possible that it is not. And 2. Persuasion, and argues for the latter by asserting that this path attends truth or reality. The second road, in contrast, she identifies with 1. Necessary non-existence, by claiming that it is not, and it is necessary that it is not. And 2. Contends that it is a path wholly without tidings. She offers two arguments for the tidinglessness of this path. First, she argues that one cannot know that which is not, since it simply cannot be accomplished. And secondly, she contends that one cannot point out what is not. She then reveals that both arguments for the tidinglessness of the path of non-being are grounded in the identification of thinking and being, for it is the very same, to think and to be. Standard interpretations take Parmenides to here present a deductive argument. One might, for example, begin with the concept of a being, a necessary being an F, where F stands for some essential property of a thing, or being an intentional object, and then attempt to reconstruct Parmenides' argument deductively on that basis. The problem with such accounts is that they end up attributing bad arguments to Parmenides, and then account for the failures of these arguments along familiar patronizing lines, explaining them in light of the supposed crudity of the concepts with which he was forced to work, living as he did before Kripke. Consider, for example, the deductive reading most straightforwardly suggested by the text, the attempt to deduce the properties of being from the concept of a necessary being. Yet, even if we were able to deduce properties like eternity or indestructibility from the concept of a necessary being, it is not clear how we could bridge the gap between such metaphysical properties and the epistemic properties of persuasiveness and the accompanying of truth that Parmenides ascribes to the path of being. One might grant, for example, that such a necessary being may exist, but contend that it would so far transcend us and our cognitive capacities that we could never know it. On such a scenario, the mere existence of a necessary being would have little, if any, persuasive force. And the same holds for the property of accompanying the truth. A necessary being may exist, but its mere existence does not guarantee that any predicate that I might ascribe to it would genuinely apply to it, or result in a true proposition. For example, suppose that the science of arithmetic exists necessarily. Just because it does so does not guarantee that every predicate I might apply to it is true. I might, for example, maintain that it is decidable, that every truth within it can be formally proven through its own axioms, but later discover that it, in fact, is undecidable. These sorts of concerns have led Kingsley to deny that the goddess is attempting to make any sort of rational argument, claiming, quote, "Any sensible person who has read this and been told that it's a foundational text for the Western science of logic would have every good reason to die of laughter. Everything about it is absurd. It's absurd in what it says, absurd in its vagueness and obscurity, and its careful, measured tone creates an illusory impression of reasonableness that makes everything about it even more nonsensically obscure. Nonsense is what it sounds like, and nonsense is what this is, because there is nothing here to do with our familiar world of the senses. What Parmenides is saying comes from another world." End quote. Yet, Kingsley is too quick to reject reason. Though her argument does not resemble the kinds of arguments put forward by contemporary analytic philosophers, this by no means implies that the goddess offers no argument whatsoever. Indeed, one wonders whether Kingsley would draw the same conclusions concerning the pronouncements of other famous philosophers, and maintain that they too are speaking in riddles, pure mystery, sheer obscurity, and pronouncing an initiatory logic when they say things such as, quote, "The possibility, Indeed, even the necessity of these categories rests on the relation that the entire sensibility, and with it also all possible appearances, have to the original apperception, in which everything is necessarily in agreement with the conditions of thoroughgoing unity of self-consciousness, i.e., must stand under universal functions of synthesis, namely of the synthesis in accordance with concepts, as that in which alone apperception can demonstrate a priori its thoroughgoing and necessary identity." End quote. Or, quote, "Thus the supersensible world, which is the inverted world, has at the same time overarched the other world and has it within it. It is for itself the inverted world, i.e., the inversion of itself. It is itself and its opposite in one unity. Only thus is it difference as inner difference, or difference in its own self, or difference as an infinity." End quote. Or again, quote, "The nothing itself does not attract. It is essentially repelling. But this repulsion is itself as such a parting gesture towards beings that are submerging as a whole. This wholly repelling gesture towards beings that are in retreat as a whole, which is the action of the nothing that oppresses Dasein in anxiety, is the essence of the nothing, nihilation. It is neither an annihilation of beings, nor does it spring from a negation. Nihilation will not submit to calculation in terms of annihilation and negation. The nothing itself annihilates." End quote. Even if we were to agree with Kingsley as to the fundamentally religious character of Parmenides' thought, this religious dimension need not rule out rational argument. Biblical writers, for example, appeal to reason, and the ontological argument, a foundational argument in Western metaphysics and philosophical theology, was originally set forth as a prayer. In fact, cognizance of Parmenides' identity as an iatromantis figure allows us to formulate an alternative reading of the goddess's argument that can avoid the problems of standard deductive accounts. For, if we take the goddess to be propounding a transcendental rather than merely deductive method, the connection between the metaphysical and epistemological attributes of the path of being becomes clear. Transcendental arguments, unlike standard deductive arguments, begin with some given fact, often a fact about consciousness, and then go on to elucidate the conditions of the possibility for that fact. For example, Kant famously began with experience, the familiar apprehension of some object having a property, and claimed that for such experience to be possible, something would need to be given to us in space and time, through the forms of intuition, and we would need to be able to apply some basic concepts to it, which he called the categories. This would hold true regardless of what the individual experience might be. You might experience a rose as red, a flash of lightning as brilliant, or a mountain as majestic. In each case, the experience in question is given in space and time and is conceptually structured. Thus, Kant held that transcendental inquiries, like deductive ones, hold a priori, prior to or independent of any particular experience. And, in like manner, Husserl took himself to provide a transcendental phenomenology by bracketing the world of empirical objects and examining instead the structures given in pure consciousness. Now, suppose that we began our inquiry not with ordinary human experiences of flowers, lightning, and mountains, but with ecstatic experiences that take us beyond the bounds of mundane consciousness. In other words, what if we attempted to provide a transcendental phenomenology of shamanic states of consciousness rather than the ordinary states of consciousness that most philosophers focus upon? This unfamiliar route, I contend, is the one the goddess recommends in the way of truth. To begin with, the goddess's language in D6 suggests that her argument will turn on the examination of some conscious state. After commissioning Parmenides as her prophet, she sets forth two roads for thinking, and concludes by proclaiming that to think and to be are the same. Today, we think about thinking in a particular way, distinguishing thought, for example, from sensation, or perhaps separating the abstract contents of thought from the thinking mind to form a domain of pure logic. But this is not what the Greeks had in mind with the verb naein, which we often translate as to think, or the noun nous, which we often translate as reason, thought, or intellect. Naeo, for example, could mean not only I think, but also I perceive, apprehend, or take notice. And nous could mean not only intellect, but also mind in the more general sense of that which perceives, remembers, feels, or intends. In short, to think, in this sense, concerns consciously apprehending something in some way or other, rather than specifically apprehending it as a propositional content of thought, as distinct, for example, from perception, feeling, or imagination. Thus, Homer uses forms of naein to describe Nestor seeing horses, Helen recognizing Aphrodite by her beautiful throat, breasts, and eyes, or Penelope failing to perceive that the man standing before her is her husband Odysseus. And the goddess's concern with conscious apprehension is also indicated by the other words she uses in this passage. For example, Heidegger has famously argued that aletheia, the Greek word for truth, is the negation of lethe, the Greek word for forgetting, oblivion, or concealment, and so translates it as unconcealment. Likewise, gignoskein, the verb meaning to know, think, or form a judgment, can also mean to discern, distinguish, recognize, or be aware of, and can even signify carnal knowledge. And phratsein, a verb the goddess uses to characterize the type of demonstration she offers, similarly concerns conscious experience, and primarily means to point out or show. It is used, for instance, by Homer to describe the place pointed out by Achilles upon which to construct Patroclus's funeral pyre, and Eurycleia's recognition of Odysseus' scar. And it is also used by Pindar when he asks his fellow citizens to show him the home of his fathers. The language used in D6 thus indicates that the goddess's argument will involve the elucidation of some type of conscious state. Indeed, she then goes on to specify the particular kind of conscious state she has in mind: the encounter with necessary being. Yet, there are actually many different forms of such an encounter, since there are various types of necessary beings and various modes of apprehending them. So, we will need to determine just what sort of experience and necessary object the goddess is directing us towards in this passage. For example, a Platonist about numbers, properties, and propositions will consider all of these to be necessary objects. So, in this scenario, thinking of the number 3, the property of being bipedal, and the proposition that the tallest man in Athens is a man, would all be states of consciousness in which one encounters a necessary being. However, these sorts of necessaria, though the first to come to mind for contemporary philosophers, are not our only options. And this is a good thing, since it appears that the standard sorts of necessaria fail to ground the goddess's epistemic claims about the way of truth. For example, even if a propositional content were to exist necessarily, the mere thinking of it need not suffice to persuade one to believe it, much less guarantee its truth. Yet, there is a well-documented type of experience of necessary being capable of grounding the goddess's epistemic claims: the direct experience of God, the I am that I am. Such direct mystical encounters with the divine are said to constitute a special form of knowledge. Consider, for example, some notable Christian testimonies concerning this kind of experience. The medieval poet Dante attests to his direct experience of divine light as follows, quote, "I believe that from the keenness of the living ray that I endured, I would have been undone had I withdrawn my eyes from it. And I remember that, on this account, I grew more bold and thus sustained my gaze until I reached the goodness that is infinite. O plenitude of grace, by which I could presume to fix my eyes upon eternal light, until my sight was spent on it. In its depth I saw contained, by love into a single volume bound, the pages scattered through the universe, substances, accidents, and the interplay between them, as though they were conflated in such ways that what I tell is but a simple light. Thus all my mind, absorbed, was gazing, fixed, unmoving, and intent, becoming more enraptured in its gazing. He who beholds that light is so enthralled that he would never willingly consent to turn away from it for any other sight, because the good that is the object of the will is held and gathered in perfection there, that elsewhere would imperfect show." End quote. Here, Dante is transfixed by a divine light that reveals itself as the infinite good, the true object of all desire, containing everything, all substances, accidents, and relations within its own simple luminosity. Likewise, the great theologian and mystic Meister Eckhart testifies to finding so much pleasure in the experience of union with God that even the pains of hell would be easy to bear. He declares, quote, "A man who is established thus in God's will wants nothing but what is God's will and what is God. If he were sick, he would not want to be well. To him all pain is pleasure. All multiplicity is bare simplicity, if he is truly established in the will of God. Even though it meant the pains of hell, it would be a joy and happiness to him. He is free and has left self behind, and must be free of whatever is to come into him. If my eye is to perceive color, it must be free of all color. If I see a blue or white color, the sight of my eye which sees the color, the very thing that sees, is the same as that which is seen by the eye. The eye with which I see God is the same eye with which God sees me. My eye and God's eye are one eye, one seeing, one knowing, and one love." End quote. Here, Eckhart attests to an experience of divinization, wherein one knows God in God's own knowledge of himself, and loves God in God's own love of himself. In such a state, multiplicity is reduced to simplicity, and all the pains of mortal existence are sublated in the beatific vision. And finally, Jakob Boehme, the Protestant visionary who inspired the philosophy of Hegel, attests to his experience of all things in God as follows, quote, "In 1/4 of an hour I saw and knew more than if I had been many years together at a university. For I saw and knew the being of all things, the bis and the abyss, and the eternal generation of the Holy Trinity, the descent and original of the world, and of all creatures through divine wisdom. I knew and saw in myself all the three worlds, the external and visible world being of a procreation or external birth from both the internal and spiritual worlds. And I saw and knew the whole working essence, in the evil and in the good, and the mutual original and existence, and likewise how the fruitful bearing womb of eternity brought forth. So that I did not greatly wonder at it, but did also exceedingly rejoice, albeit I could very hardly apprehend the same in my external man, and set it down with the pen. For I had a thorough view of the universe as in a chaos, wherein all things are couched and wrapped up, but it was impossible for me to explicate the same." End quote. Boehme, like Dante and Eckhart, here attests to the metaphysical and epistemological character of his experience. In it, he sees the being of all things, the abyss of God, and the origin of Trinitarian life. And in so doing, he knows, through the divine wisdom, all created things, including aspects of himself previously hidden from view. Attending to these kinds of experiences allows us to articulate an interpretation of the goddess's argument, which avoids the difficulties of standard deductive readings. First, by identifying the path of being pointed out by the goddess with the direct experience of God, we can account for the positive epistemic features attributed to this route. To begin with, such a direct vision of God would be persuasive. Indeed, more persuasive than any other sort of experience, since mystical experiences have what William James has called a noetic quality. James explains, quote, "Although similar to states of feeling, mystical states seem to those who experience them to be also states of knowledge. They are states of insight into depths of truth unplumbed by the discursive intellect." End quote. Hence, if such an experience were to constitute the path of being, we could explain why the goddess would call this path the path of persuasion. Furthermore, this identification also explains why the goddess would say that it accompanies aletheia, for it is easy to see how aletheia, in all its possible significations, would attend that path. If we understand aletheia epistemologically as the sort of truth that attends propositional content, then the vision of God would attend such truth. In seeing God, one sees how all things abide in God. One sees, like Dante, substances, accidents, and the interplay between them. Or, like Boehme, the descent and original of the world and of all creatures, the whole working essence, and how the fruitful bearing womb of eternity brought forth. One grasps a theory of everything by beholding all things in the divine mind. Likewise, if we take aletheia in its more metaphysical connotation, as signifying what is real or genuine, as opposed to false semblances, then, once more, the vision of God would attend truth, since, in it, one would be confronted with reality at its most genuine. One would see the realm of, quote, "truth unveiled, truth as it is in and for itself, God, in his eternal essence, before the creation of nature and finite mind." End quote. And finally, if, as Heidegger suggests, we take aletheia in the phenomenological sense of unconcealedness, then, yet again, the vision of God would attend truth. For, to see God in this manner would be to see the Deus revelatus, to see reality, not through a mirror darkly, but face to face. On this interpretation, just as the necessary being in question is of a particular kind, so too is the allegedly necessary non-being. Just as we were not referring to necessaria such as numbers, properties, or propositions when formulating the way of being, so too are we not referring to various impossibilia, such as those that would be designated by the set of all self-membered sets, the property of being a human orange, and propositions of the form A and not A, when formulating the way of non-being. Here, non-being is identified not with the failure of anything in the world to satisfy some given description, but with there being no world at all. Sheer oblivion would be the impossible object that defines the way of non-being. Kant attempts to clarify this sort of necessary oblivion when he distinguishes between the logical and material elements of possibility. To say something is logically possible is to say it satisfies the principle of non-contradiction. Yet, such a logical element of possibility, according to Kant, presupposes an even more fundamental type of possibility, the material element of possibility, the fact that something is there to be thought at all. Hence, what we mean by necessary non-being, in this case, is an absolutely empty world. A world wherein there could be no one to think and nothing to be thought. When we identify the path of being with the direct experience of God, and the path of non-being with the putative experience of a necessarily empty world, then it becomes clear why the goddess would endorse the first path and reject the second as absurd. If one were, in a transcendental manner, to take the mystical experience of God as a given, then one could derive both the existence of God and the knowledge of the existence of God as conditions of its possibility, in light of that experience's unique epistemic features. Now, God, as necessary being, must exist at all possible worlds, and this entails that there could be no empty worlds, much less necessarily empty ones. And since the path of non-being is identified with the alleged experience of a necessarily empty world, that path proves to be impossible. If one were to experience the mystical vision of necessary being, the absurdity of the attempt to follow the path of necessary non-being would be obvious. Furthermore, this interpretation allows for a practical as well as theoretical argument for the superiority of the path of being over that of non-being. Classicists have pointed out that the image of a path leading to a fork in the road, and the resulting choice between two ways, is chiefly associated with the choice between the two destinies one faces upon death. Plato, for example, describes such a choice when he claims that Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Aeacus will, quote, serve as judges in the meadow, at the three-way crossing from which the two roads go on, the one to the Isles of the Blessed, and the other to Tartarus. End quote. Here, Plato depicts a choice between an afterlife of reward in the Isles of the Blessed, or punishment in Tartarus. Furthermore, classicists have also observed how not to be and to be without tidings are euphemisms for death. So, when the goddess offers the choice between the paths of being and non-being, she is offering a choice between the experience of the fullness of divine life and absolute oblivion as a second death. Again, to those who have experienced the former, the choice is obvious. Those who have tasted the honey in the honeycomb know that it is sweet. Finally, this interpretation can explain why the goddess would affirm that it is the very same, to think and also to be. Recall that mystical experiences are experiences of oneness in which man is absorbed in God and thinks God through God's own mind. Reality is, in this manner, experienced as simple. In such an experience, there is no distinction between one's own eye and God's eye. All multiplicity is bare simplicity. All distinctions between properties are conflated in a simple light, and one perceives the being of all things. According to William James, such unity is a distinctive mark of mystical experience. He observes that, quote, this overcoming of all the usual barriers between the individual and the absolute is the great mystic achievement. In mystic states, we both become one with the absolute, and we become aware of our oneness. End quote. In such unity, there would be no real distinction between God's being and his mind, between his mind and the contents of his mind, and between the contents of his mind and existing things. In philosophical theology, this understanding of the divine nature was called the doctrine of divine simplicity. The unity presented in mystical experience thus allows us to explain the goddess's otherwise puzzling identification of thinking and being. To think and to be are the same, since, for God, they are the same, and the initiate would know this fact through direct experience. The goddess further elaborates the relation between thought and being in ecstatic experience in the following fragment, quote, behold those things which, though far off, are nevertheless steadfastly near to thought. For it cannot sever what is from holding fast to what is, whether it is dispersed in any and every way through the world, or is collected together. End quote. Here, the goddess once more makes her case by asking us to look on, as she points out key features of a particular kind of experience. She claims that in such an experience, even things that seem far are, in fact, steadfastly near to thought, and argues that this nearness is grounded in the fact that thought cannot sever being from holding fast to being. Again, the goddess's claim most clearly applies to the mystical experience of God. In light of divine simplicity, the divine mind cannot sunder itself from divine being, nor separate one divine attribute from another. The goddess's claim also applies to ecstatic experiences of a less elevated variety. The shaman, for instance, is said in his journeys to transcend the limits of physical space, so as to apprehend distant objects. Perhaps the most literal manifestation of this shamanic transcendence of space is the phenomenon of bilocation. Pythagoras, for example, was said to be able to converse with friends in Metapontum and Tauromenium at the same time, and Aristeas was said to have conversed with a man from one town, while his body lay, seemingly lifeless, at a fuller's shop in a different town. In such states, one would quite literally see how what is holds fast to what is, despite seemingly being dispersed through the world. And there are similar stories of shamans reaching outside of the normal flow of time. In prophecy, for example, the shaman is able to perceive future events, and Pythagoras was said to have been aware of his own past lives and those of his followers. Porphyry recounts, quote, "Many of his associates he reminded of the lives lived by their souls before they were bound to their present body, and by irrefutable arguments demonstrated that he had been Euphorbus, the son of Panothus." End quote. Epimenides, likewise, is reported to have fallen asleep in a cave of the nymphs, and to have awoken to find 57 years had elapsed. And Aristeas is said to have reappeared to human society after being absent for 240 years, claiming to have been traveling with Apollo. In this regard, it is also interesting to note that the verb in our passage, which has been translated as holding fast, is a form of echo, which Homer uses to describe the way that the gods inhabit heaven, or Mount Olympus, or the nymphs haunt the high mountain places, springs, and meadows. This suggests that the goddess maintains that the way being holds fast to being, despite being dispersed through the world or collected together, is akin to the way that non-human intelligences relate to space and time. Thus, to those granted the vision of being, the choice between paths has already been made. It was a foregone conclusion from the start. The goddess explains, quote, "The decision on these matters depends on this: is or is not. Well, it has been decided, as is necessary, to abandon the one as unthinkable, unnameable, for it is not the true road, and deciding thereby that the other, by consequence, exists and is real." End quote. The choice between being and non-being is decided in the vision of the former. Being crowns its graces. Yet, the goddess also warns of another illusory path to be avoided, the way of mortal opinion. She declares, quote, "It is needful to say and to think that that which is, for it is to be, whereas nothing is not. That is precisely what I bid you to ponder. For such is the first road of investigation from which I keep you away. For then also from this one, which mortals who know nothing fashion for themselves, two-headed. For the helplessness in their breast directs their wandering mind, and they are borne along, deaf and likewise blind, stupefied, tribes undecided, who suppose that to be and not to be is the same and not the same, and that for all the path is backward turning." End quote. Note how the goddess's language once more indicates the crucial role that consciousness plays in her argument. The verb phratzein, to point out or show, is again used here. In D6, the goddess shows that the path of non-being is a path without tidings, and argues that you could never point out such a path. Now the goddess commands Parmenides to point out to himself, phrasesthai, i.e. muse upon or ponder, that being is and nothing is not. After reminding Parmenides of the futility of the path of non-being, the goddess then warns him against the equally fruitless path of mortal opinion. She does not paint a flattering picture of mankind in the process. From her divine perspective, men are ignorant, double-minded creatures, their wandering minds directed by their heart's helplessness, passively carried along by the forces that manipulate them, deaf, blind, stupefied, and undecided. Their fundamental error, claims the goddess, lies in confusing being and non-being, and holding them at once to be both identical and different. In their confusion, the mortal path is forever backward turning, circling back on itself, since men never make the decision to pursue being or non-being. Instead, they hover at the crossroads, like the undecided in the vestibule to Dante's Inferno, who are driven on by stinging wasps to wander in circles, rejected by both heaven and hell for refusing to choose between them. Mortals thus stand in marked contrast to the kouros described earlier in the proem. Whereas the kouros has the power to attain his desire, since he is carried as far as his thumos might take him, the hearts of mortal men are helpless. Whereas the kouros walks the path of the one who knows, mortal men lack knowledge and remain deaf, blind, and stupefied. And whereas the kouros is escorted straight along the way into the house of the goddess, the wandering minds of men drive them in barren circles. While the goddess pronounced the path of non-being an impossibility, she declares the path of mortal opinion an illusion, a confused and confusing fiction concocted by the mortal mind. Indeed, she claims that sheer habit is its primary motivating force. She warns in a later fragment, quote, "For never at all could you master this, that things that are not. But as for you, keep the mind away from this road of investigation, and do not let much experienced habit force you down onto this road, to ply a heedless eye and roaring ear and tongue. No, by the word, choose the much contested refutation spoken by me. There remains only the word of the path is." End quote. According to the goddess, those who tread the mortal path not only mistakenly consider the way of non-being to be a viable option, by maintaining that things that are not, but they also conflate that way with the way of being. Yet, as the goddess has previously demonstrated, for those who have experienced the absolute, the way of non-being is, in fact, no way at all. The mortal perspective is thus based on a fundamental confusion, and the entire worldview that flows from that confusion proves to be illusory. People adopt the mortal viewpoint not on account of reason, but out of mere habit, specifically the habit of inattention. It is interesting to note how, despite the standard depiction of Parmenides as the opponent of sense experience, the goddess does not condemn experience as such in this passage. She warns against neither eye nor ear, but only the heedless eye, the eye which cannot see, and the roaring ear, the ear that cannot hear over one's own shouting tongue. In fact, the goddess's overarching transcendental argument in the poem presupposes a direct experience of being. Parmenides is asked, at the end of the passage cited above, to choose by the word. But the word that remains at this point is that of being. For the path of being is the only path that accounts for the conditions of the possibility of mystical experience. The goddess further clarifies the distinction between the way of being and the way of mortal opinion by distinguishing between the types of signs that attend them. The goddess has already noted that the fundamental confusion of mortal opinion is its fail to discriminate between being and non-being, and that the main temptation towards accepting this confusion is the blind adherence to habit. She then goes on to further specify what this mortal confusion between being and non-being consists in, by explaining the nature of the signs men fabricate for themselves. She declares, quote, "For they have laid down for themselves forms to name two ways of knowing, of which one is not necessary, in which they wander, and they have sundered the living frame into opposites, and posited signs separate from each other. For the one, the ethereal fire of flame, being mild, very light in weight, the same as itself everywhere, and not the same as the other one. And that one too, in itself, the opposite, night without light, a dense and heavy body." End quote. The goddess here claims that men fashion two opposed signs, each of which is taken to correspond to both 1. A mode of being, and 2. A mode of knowledge. In viewing reality exclusively through these opposing signs, mankind sunders the living frame into opposites and separates beings from one another. These two exclusive signs are fire, which is, for example, luminous, mild, light, and rarefied, and night, which is dark, harsh, heavy, and dense. From the mortal viewpoint, everything in the cosmos is thought to be constituted from these two fundamental natural kinds, and grasped through these two corresponding modes of representation by the mind. It is thus the positing of the two opposed signs of light and night that generates the mortal confusion between being and non-being. For each of these signs is taken to be what it is intrinsically, to be the same as itself everywhere. Fire, for example, is thought to be intrinsically luminous. It is what it is independently of its relations to anything else. And in like manner, night is thought to be intrinsically dark. It too is what it is independently of its relations to other things. But, at the same time, each is taken not to be the other. An essential feature of fire's luminosity, for instance, is its not being dark, and an essential feature of night's darkness is its not being light. In this manner, ordinary consciousness represents being and non-being as both identical and non-identical. Though the goddess's technical description of light and night will likely strike us as archaic, the picture she presents does seem to track our everyday human experience. Consider, for example, our experience of space and time. Each point of space seems to be an independent unit, a here that is what it is independently of any other point in space. Yet, such a here can only be individuated in terms of its relation to every other here. It is this here because it is not there. The same goes for our experience of time. I experience a moment of time, a now, that is what it is independently of any other time. Yet I can only individuate that now, that particular point of time, by relating it to all other possible points of time. It is now because it is not then. The same goes for our perceptual and conceptual experiences. I might perceive a book as rectangular, and that rectangularity would seem to be an intrinsic property. It is what it is apart from its relations to anything else. Yet, in order for me to see the rectangularity of the book, I need to distinguish its edges from the rest of the visual field. To see the book as rectangular, I need to see that it is not the table on which it rests, or the wall in front of which it stands. Or again, I might conceive of Socrates as a human, and the concept of being a human seems to be what it is apart from its relation to anything else. Yet, at the same time, it seems that the concept human means what it does only by negating other concepts. For example, from the fact that Socrates is a human, I can infer that he is not a cloud or an orange. In this manner, the goddess's doctrine of the two signs that mark the road of mortal opinion appears to capture our ordinary human experience. The world represented by the mind of man is a world that wavers back and forth between is and is not. And, as the goddess observes, this worldview is recommended largely through habit. It's not as if we woke up one day, thought through things thoroughly, and decided to apprehend the world through representations of space and time, and finite concepts of the understanding. This worldview, instead, was something we were thrown into at birth, and defines the ordinary reality to which we are accustomed. In contrast to the familiar signs marking the path of mortal opinion, strange signs attend the path of being. To begin with, rather than only two, the goddess proclaims that there are very many signs that announce being's way. She maintains, quote, "On this one there are signs, very many of them, that being, it is uncreated, indestructible, whole, unique, unmoved, and eternal." End quote. The path of being has an abundance of signs. The goddess lists 6, but there may well be more. Furthermore, instead of functioning as binary opposites, as do signs on the mortal way, for example, light and dark, hot and cold, light and heavy, etc., these divine signs, as will be made clear in the goddess's subsequent argument, are mutually implicating. So, instead of excluding one another, each elucidates all others, like a set of mirrors reflecting to infinity. Or, to borrow an analogy from Trinitarian doctrine, each divine sign stands in perichoresis, or mutual encircling with the others. In the words of St. Augustine, quote, "They are infinite in themselves, so both each are in each, and all in each, and each in all, and all in all, and all are one. Let him who sees this, whether in part or through a glass and in an enigma, rejoice in knowing God. And let him honor him as God and give thanks. But let him who does not see it strive to see it through piety, not cavil at it through blindness." End quote. Being signs thus do not stand in the sorts of exclusion relations that attend those on the mortal path. For instance, from the fact that being is unbegotten, agenitos, we cannot infer that it is not uniquely begotten, monogenes, as we would if these were mortal concepts. And the mutually implicating nature of these divine signs also explains an erstwhile puzzling fragment. In this fragment, the goddess declares, quote, "In common, for me, is the point from which I shall begin, for I shall return there once again later." End quote. Given that each sign elucidates all others, one could start at any point and proceed through the whole to return once more to the beginning. This sort of fruitful circularity, wherein one spirals ever upward into deeper knowledge of being, contrasts with the empty circularity of the mortal path, which forever flits between being and non-being. The goddess then examines the signs of being and reveals how each is contained in the other and in the experience of the absolute. In summarizing the goddess's arguments, I'll depart from her order of exposition and examine each of the signs in turn, being 1. Increate, 2. Indestructible, 3. Whole, 4. Unique, 5. Unmoved, and 6. Eternal. Aseity, existence without having been created by another, is a sign of necessary being. Consider again the direct experience of God. As noted earlier, such an experience would be an experience of something necessary, something which cannot not be. Now, if such being were created, then there would be a possible world at which it was not, namely, the world in which it had not been created. Yet this would mean that necessary being is not, in fact, necessary, since, by definition, necessary being would exist at all possible worlds. So, necessary being cannot be created. It is essentially increate. The goddess articulates this core insight in several ways. She begins with the question, quote, "What birth could you seek for it? How? From what could it have grown?" End quote. She then argues that necessary being could not have been generated from necessary non-being when she answers, quote, "Not from what is not. I shall not allow you to say or to think this, for it cannot be said nor thought that is not." End quote. The goddess here appears to be setting forth an additional transcendental argument. The proponent of the thesis that being, in the strong sense, is created from nothing, in the strong sense, is committed to the following proposition. C. Necessary being is created by necessary non-being. As noted earlier, such necessary non-being would constitute an empty world, a world in which there would be no propositional content. Thus, in such a world, C cannot be said or thought. In other words, the falsehood of C is a condition of the possibility of entertaining or asserting C. The goddess next, laying the foundation for later cosmological arguments, contends that, even if one were, contrary to fact, to be able to think necessary non-being, it would be absurd to think that anything could be generated from such a world. She maintains, quote, "Neither will any force of belief ever affirm that out of what is not, something is born beside itself." End quote. The idea here is presumably that, if something is created, then something must have created it. But if the world were completely empty, as would be the case with necessary non-being, then there would be no something to do the creating. Hence, nothing could have been created from necessary non-being, and thus, necessary being could not have been created from it. The goddess then refutes the suggestion that necessary being could be created by an object of human opinion, something composed of a mixture of being and non-being, or light and night. She points out that, in such a scenario, necessary being would have to be generated in time. And given our experience of time, this would mean that it must be created at some particular moment as opposed to another. But this leads to difficulties. The goddess begins by asking, quote, "What need could have compelled it to grow later rather than sooner if it had had nothing for a beginning?" End quote. This question suggests two arguments. First, the goddess may be once more laying the groundwork for later metaphysics by articulating a principle of sufficient reason. According to such a principle, for any fact F, there exists some reason that explains F. This principle seems to express a fundamental need of reason, and inquiry appears to stagnate without it. So, if necessary being were to be generated at a particular moment in time, let's say T4, then there must be some reason why it was created at just that moment and not at another, such as T1, T2, or T3. Yet it doesn't appear that such a reason can be provided, since each moment of time is itself indifferent in terms of its suitability for the creation of necessary being. This, then, leads to the second argument. The defender of the creation of necessary being might attempt to appeal to some particular state of affairs at a given time to explain why that moment was more propitious for creating it than any other. Yet, this approach reveals an even deeper problem than the violation of the principle of sufficient reason. As observed earlier, the very idea of necessary being coming to existence at all is incoherent. As the goddess declares, quote, "So it is necessary that it either be completely or not at all." End quote. To say that necessary being was created by a contingent object in the mortal world would be to say that there was a time in which being was not. But this could not hold true for necessary being. The goddess also shows how being's aseity follows from its eternality, as the two signs mutually implicate each other. She explains, quote, "For if it was born, it is not any more than if it is going to be someday. In this way, birth is extinguished." End quote. To be eternal on this conception is to escape the flow of time. It is to exist in a timeless present untouched by past and future. Something eternal is thus not the kind of thing that was and then is no more, or will be, but isn't. But if being were to be created by something in the world of human opinion, then it would, contra the doctrine of eternality, have to come to be in time. The goddess likewise shows how being's eternality implies its indestructibility, proclaiming that the argument articulated above reveals how unknowable destruction is extinguished. If being were to be destroyed, then it would have to have existed up to a given point in time, been annihilated, and then no longer exist. But this is impossible given the eternality of being. If being abides in an eternal now outside of the flow of time, then it cannot be destroyed in time. The goddess also reveals how indestructibility follows from wholeness. She instructs, quote, "Nor is it divisible, since as a whole it is similar. Nor at all more here, which would prevent it from cohering. Nor at all weaker, but as a whole it is full of being. That is why as a whole it is continuous, for what is adjacent to what is." End quote. Two arguments are again suggested here. First, the goddess indicates that as a genuine whole, being must fully cohere with itself. This complete coherence renders division impossible. One might then observe that destruction appears to be coextensive with the loss of some or all of a thing's essential components. A house, for example, is destroyed by an earthquake when its walls and roof collapse. But since being admits no division, no components can be removed, much less any essential ones. And so, being cannot be destroyed. Second, one might observe that destruction appears to involve the exploitation of a weak point in a given system. For example, even Achilles, the strongest of Homeric warriors, was said to have been killed by an attack on his heel, his only vulnerable point. But being, given that it is whole, has no weak point to be exploited, and so cannot be destroyed. Being's wholeness shines forth from several other features of being. The goddess first shows how being's wholeness follows from its necessity, proclaiming, quote, "For strong necessity holds it fast within the bonds of the limit, which confines it on all sides. That is why it is not allowed that what is be incomplete. For it is not lacking. If it were, it would lack everything." End quote. Consider again being as encountered in mystical experience. It is presented as absolutely necessary, admitting of no non-being. In other words, being can lack nothing, and if it were to lack something, it would be a different kind of being, not necessary being. And since to lack nothing is to be whole, wholeness is a condition of the possibility of the experience of the absolute. In this manner, the goddess contrasts necessary being with the beings that exist for mortal opinion. For, in being defined in terms of both light and darkness, each of which is taken as something that both is and is not, the objects of mortal opinion essentially lack wholeness, whereas wholeness is essential to necessary being. This contrast is reinforced by the language used in this passage. Fierce necessity, for mortals, brings suffering and death. For example, Hector, in his famous speech before the Scaean Gate, uses the term strong necessity to describe the horrors to befall his wife Andromache after his death as she is dragged off to slavery. And the language of the bonds of limit also reinforce the idea of slavery and even death. But these same terms have no such power over being. Strong necessity and its bonds of limit serve only to ensure its wholeness and perfection. Second, being's wholeness is also implied by the identity of thought and being. The goddess explains, quote, "This is the same, to think and the thought that is. For not without being in which it is betrothed will you find thinking. For nothing else is or will be besides what is, since fate has bound this to be whole and unmovable, so that its name will be all the things about which mortals have established, convinced that they are true, that they are born and are destroyed, are and are not, change their place and modify their bright color." End quote. Consider again the mystical experience in which my eye which sees God is identical to God's eye which sees me. Here, thinking is identical to what is thought, since one is aware of the absolute through the same awareness that it is aware of itself. This divine thinking cannot be sundered from the fullness of the divine nature, in which it is betrothed to all the rest of the divine attributes. Attributes which ultimately point to simplicity. Divine thought, then, would essentially be whole, grasping the entirety of the divine nature. If the content of divine thought were to lack something, it would no longer be the thought of the absolute. So, a condition of the possibility of mystical experience is that being be whole. And, once more, the malefic language used to describe the objects of mortal opinion proves to be benefic when applied to being. Moira, the goddess of fate, is usually associated with evil and death. Strictly speaking, Moira means part or portion. For example, it could be a portion of meat, or a portion of war booty, or the limited portion of life granted to mortals. Yet, paradoxically, being's portion is to be whole, to be incapable of being portioned up. And, again, the binding usually associated with slavery and death becomes, for being, a binding to wholeness and perfection. Third, the goddess shows how being's inability to be limited by non-being implies that it must be whole. She observes, quote, "Moreover, since its limit is most distant, it is completed on every side, similar to the volume of a well-rounded ball, everywhere balanced, equally starting from its center. For neither is there non-being which could stop it from reaching what is similar to it, nor is there being so that of being there would be more here or less there, since as a whole it is inviolable. For, equal to itself on every side, it maintains itself in its limits, similarly." End quote. The goddess here proclaims that being cannot be limited by non-being. One might consider being as limited by non-being in one of two ways, either through necessary non-being or through the non-being constitutive of the objects of mortal opinion. But being could not be limited by necessary non-being, since there would be nothing there to do the limiting. Likewise, being could not be limited by the contingent beings of mortal experience, since, in order for them to do so, being would have to admit to the same kind of mixture of being and non-being that they do, being more here and less there. But it doesn't. And so, since being cannot be limited by necessary non-being, or the contingent beings of mortal experience, it stretches out fully in all directions, which is to say, it is whole. The limits imposed upon it, limits which are most distant, are self-imposed limits. Equal to itself on every side, it maintains itself in its limits, similarly. The wholeness of being also secures its uniqueness. As the goddess has previously observed, since fate has bound us to be whole, nothing else is or will be besides what is. Suppose, 1, that being is whole and lacks nothing, and 2, that there are two such beings. Since, according to 2, these two beings are distinct, there must be some kind of difference between them. Whatever this difference might consist in, it must be possessed by one of these beings as opposed to the other. And this implies that one of these beings would lack something possessed by the other. But, according to 1, being is whole and lacks nothing. So, either one or both of the beings posited in 2 cannot be equivalent to the being affirmed in 1. As a result, if being is whole, then there could be only one such being, which is to say, it would have to be unique. Being's unmovability follows from its uniqueness and wholeness. The goddess explains their relations as follows, quote, "Remaining the same and in the same, it rests in itself and thus remains stable there. For powerful necessity holds it fast within the bonds of the limit, which confines it on all sides." End quote. Two arguments are suggested by the goddess's observations here. First, as unique, being remains the same and rests in the same, and thus remains stable there. Motion is a relation between two things, even if one of those things is empty space. But since being is unique, there is nothing outside of itself in which it could move. And since it is simple, it has no parts that could move relative to one another. Therefore, motion cannot apply to being, and hence it is unmovable. Moreover, the second half of the quote suggests an argument from wholeness. Being remains stable since powerful necessity holds it fast within the bonds of the limit, which confines it on all sides. If being were to move, it would undergo some form of change, and thus either lose or gain something. But this is ruled out by being's wholeness. If it were to lose something, it would no longer be whole, and thus no longer be being. And if it were to gain something, it would not have been whole prior to gaining that thing, and thus would not have been being. Likewise, the goddess suggests that the considerations motivating wholeness serve to motivate unmovability as well, when she proclaims, quote, "Destiny has bound us to be whole and unmovable." End quote. And the goddess also shows how wholeness implies eternity. She proclaims that being, quote, "was not, nor will it be at some time, since it is now, together, whole, one, continuous." End quote. The time experienced in everyday consciousness is essentially incomplete. Things are, indeed, given to us in a present, but it is a present come from a past that is no more, and hastening towards a future yet to be. The present, for us, is fleeting. But this is neither how one experiences time in mystical experience, nor how the reality in that experience relates to time. For being's essential wholeness would exclude the kind of partial existence depicted in our ordinary experience of time. So being must be outside of time as commonly understood, and instead exist in the fullness of something like an eternal now. Likewise, when the goddess queries, after once more contrasting necessary being with necessary non-being, and maintaining that only the road of necessary being exists, quote, "How then could what is exist afterward?" End quote. She may be pointing out how being's necessity implies its eternity. One might think that an object's movement through time corresponds to certain possibilities becoming actual for it. As something moves from T1 to T2, it moves from a state of affairs in which the possibility of being at T2 had not been actual to one in which it is actual. Now, this would imply that anything that moves through time will have certain possibilities that are not actual for it. And so, since necessary being has no unactualized possibilities, it cannot move through time. That is, it must be eternal. And the goddess also points out how unmovability, uncreatedness, and invincibility imply eternity. She declares, quote, "Moreover, motionless within the limits of its great bonds, it is without beginning, without ending, since birth and destruction went wandering very far away. True belief thrust them away." End quote. Note first how the passage through time constitutes a kind of motion. Thus, since being is unmoved, it could not pass through time, and so must be eternal. Furthermore, the fact that being is uncreated also rules out temporality. For to pass through time, perpetually occupying a new ephemeral now, would be akin to being created anew at each present moment. Thus, if being is uncreated, it must also be eternal. And finally, the passage through time can be likened to a kind of destruction. The past dies in the present, which will itself be destroyed as the future comes to be. So, if being is indestructible, then it could not be subject to the flow of time. In this manner, the goddess reveals the signs of being to be mutually elucidating. To see being's necessity and its identity with thought is also to perceive its aseity, indestructibility, wholeness, uniqueness, unmovability, and eternity. Like mirrors reflecting each other to infinity, to catch sight of one of being's modes of presentation is to catch sight of all of them, as they draw one ever further up and further in to the unshaken heart of truth. Though the goddess cautions Parmenides against the way of mortal opinion, she nonetheless thoroughly explicates it. She segues to this final section of the poem as follows, quote, "At this point, for you, I stop the sure word, and what is perceived concerning truth. From here on, learn mortal opinions by listening to the deceptive order of my words." End quote. Having proclaimed the faithful and true word of being, the goddess now changes her style and announces that henceforth her words will be adorned with deception. Whereas, in the way of truth, the goddess elucidated the conditions of the possibility of the vision of God, the goddess will here, in the way of opinion, examine the world as structured by mortal ways of knowing, i.e., through the fundamental distinction between light and night and their incompatibility relations. For example, in a passage that may constitute the conclusion of the section, after the goddess has explained the organization of the perceptibles, she declares, quote, "In this way, according to opinion, these things have been born and now are, and later, having grown strong, starting from that point they will come to their end. For these things, humans have established a name that designates each one." End quote. The way of opinion thus examines what comes to be and passes away, the domain Plato would later call the realm of becoming, and explains how humans, through their distinctively mortal modes of representation, establish names for the beings populating this realm. Unfortunately, only a handful of quotations remain from the way of opinion, and scholars speculate that we may have, at best, only 10% of this final section of the poem. In it, the goddess provides a complete description of the world as it appears to mortals, using the fundamental principles of light and night to give an account of the generation of the gods, a theogony, of earth and heaven, a cosmology, and of the various creatures living on earth, including man. Plutarch, for instance, summarizes the contents of the way of opinion as follows, quote, Parmenides has also described in his poem the arrangements of the world, and after he has mixed the elements, the bright and the dark, he produces all phenomena out of them, and by means of them. For he has said many things about the earth, the heavens, the sun, the moon, and the heavenly bodies, and he recounts the origin of human beings. End quote. In short, the final section of the poem aims to provide a complete and accurate account of empirical reality. The goddess's teaching in this section is distinct from the teachings of other pre-Socratic philosophers, and when considered from a scientific point of view, its cosmology constitutes an advance over previous models. For example, it is said to include the first historical formulation of the sphericality of the Earth and of heliophotism, the view that the moon reflects the light of the sun rather than possessing a light of its own. Likewise, within the Greek tradition, it is thought to include the first identification of Venus as both the morning and evening star, and to constitute the first attempt to investigate heredity and the differentiation between male and female embryos. From such observations, contemporary philosophers conclude that Parmenides' empirical investigations have been historically underrated. Graham, for instance, declares, quote, whatever position we take about the role of Parmenides' cosmology in relation to his philosophy, we need to stop ignoring or patronizing him as an astronomer and scientist. The most remarkable burst of creative energy in early Greek astronomy begins with the speculations of Parmenides. The greatest ontologist and most abstract philosopher among the pre-Socratics is also the best theoretical scientist of his time. End quote. And Mansfeld likewise maintains that Parmenides' poem is as important a contribution to the development of science as his ontology was. Yet, these observations lead to an interpretive puzzle. If, in the section on mortal opinion, the goddess sought to express truths about our empirical world, then why would she warn Parmenides against taking this route, exposing it as a circular path of the ignorant, declaring those formulating it to lack true faith, and announcing up front that her words in this section will be deceitful? If the way of truth implies that, fundamentally, the objects of human opinion are illusions derived from the confused modes of representation constitutive of mortal experience, that, as the ancient philosopher Calotes famously charged, the inhabited cities of Europe and Asia do not really exist on Parmenides' scheme, then why would it attempt to articulate true things about that non-existent empirical world? Thankfully, the goddess answers this question at the very outset of the way of opinion. She explains the purpose of her instruction in this section as follows, quote, I tell you this orderly arrangement of the universe, all seeming, so that no way of knowing of mortals might ever drive past you. End quote. Here, the goddess pronounces a dialectical reason for delivering her teaching to Parmenides. She will articulate the realm of mere seeming so that no mortal mode of cognition will ever get past him. Parmenides, as an initiate, has been granted a divine form of cognition in the way of truth. But, given that he will be returning to the mortal world to deliver the goddess's message to us, there is a danger that he will fall back into the realm of illusion. The goddess thus sets forth the way of opinion to forearm Parmenides against the coming onslaught of appearances, and equip him to resist the blandishments of the world. And, in this passage, the goddess further contrasts mortal and divine consciousness through her allusions to scenes from Homer's Odyssey. Kingsley has pointed out that the way she expresses negation in this passage, ume pote tis, would call to mind the scene in which Odysseus tells the Cyclops Polyphemus that his name is nobody, Utis, so that, after blinding him, when the other Cyclopses gather around Polyphemus as he cries out in pain, he will tell them that nobody hurt him. And a further allusion to Homeric epic can be seen in the use of the verb perlauein, to drive past. Kingsley takes this verb to refer to the chariot race at the funeral games for Patroclus in the Iliad. But the context better fits Odysseus' voyage past the Sirens in the Odyssey. In this scene, Odysseus manages to listen to the Sirens' enchanted song as he sails past them, lashed to the mast of his ship, the rest of his crew's ears stopped fast with wax. The Sirens sing, quote, "Come this way, honored Odysseus, great glory of the Achaeans. Stay your ship so that you can listen here to our singing. For no one else has ever sailed past this place in his black ship until he has listened to the honey-sweet voice that issues from our lips." Then goes on, well pleased, knowing more than ever he did. "For we know everything that the Argives and Trojans did and suffered in wide Troy through the gods' despite. Over all the generous earth we know everything that happens." End quote. And Odysseus recounts, quote, "So they sang in sweet utterance, and the heart within me desired to listen, and I signaled my companions to set me free, nodding my brows. But they leaned on and rowed hard. But when they had rowed on past the Sirens, and we could no longer hear their voices, and lost the sound of their singing, presently my eager companions took away from their ears the beeswax with which I had stopped them. Then they set me free from my lashings." End quote. By alluding to these two scenes from the Odyssey, the goddess likens Parmenides both to the Cyclops Polyphemus and to the Sirens, and declares that she will teach him mortal opinion, so that, unlike them, he will not be outdone by human trickery. Note how both the Cyclopses and the Sirens stand decidedly outside of the mortal sphere. The Cyclopses neither build cities nor practice agriculture, but put all their trust in the immortal gods to provide for them. And the knowledge and magical songs of the Sirens sets them apart from the human world, as noted in the passages above. Parmenides is thus treated as one who belongs to this other world. By his intercourse with the goddess, he has become a denizen of the fairy realm. Unlike Odysseus, who rejected the nymph Calypso's offer of immortality so as to achieve his human nostos, Parmenides has accepted the goddess's offer of theosis. Thus, in presenting her account of the universe structured by human cognition, the goddess aims to present an essentially illusory world, the world of Maya. Though she intends her account to be detailed, systematic, and superior to its rivals, she does not take it to be ultimately true. Instead, her goal in setting forth the way of opinion is to protect Parmenides from becoming ensnared by mortal appearances. In short, the goddess intends her instruction in this section to be taken dialectically. Her account can be thought of as a kind of inverted Kantianism in this regard, whereas Kant's transcendental dialectic aims to show how we are led into error when we attempt to make judgments about what transcends what can be given in the ordinary human experience of space and time. The goddess's way of opinion seeks to reveal how we are deceived when we attempt to make judgments about what is confined to such experience. For Kant, we can know appearances, but not transcendent reality, while for the goddess, we can know transcendent reality, but not mere appearance. Kant's conclusion follows from the fact that he confines his investigation exclusively to ordinary states of human consciousness. Because the goddess takes into account expanded states of awareness, ignored by Kant and other philosophers, her teaching comes to radically different conclusions. Dialectical interpretations, such as the one I have proposed, have fallen on hard times of late. Contemporary interpreters claim that such readings saddle, quote, Parmenides with a preposterous and literally untenable view that nothing in one's experience, not even one's own self, exists. End quote. The case against the dialectical interpretation is most forcefully stated by Tor. He contends that, in light of the detailed and insightful scientific accounts provided in the way of opinion, quote, it strains credulity to suppose that, in developing such systematic, ambitious, and specific cosmological accounts, Parmenides' sole or even primary motivation was simply to construct an exemplar of all erroneous systems, or merely to exemplify an entirely general metaphysical confusion. Nor is it clear what the dialectical or inoculative benefit consists in. In Doxa, the goddess presented particular, concrete theories concerning, say, the source of the moon's light, or the embryological processes by which children become similar to one parent or the other. By elaborating these theories, and adding thereby nothing to Alethea's remarks about such processes as motion and coming to be, the goddess perhaps deters Parmenides from rival astronomical and embryological accounts, but she does not thereby inoculate him against astronomical and embryological accounts as such. Nor, again, does she thereby display an entirely general critique of cosmology as such. End quote. Tor here presents two main critiques of the dialectical reading. First, he contends that it strains credulity to believe that Parmenides would develop a novel, detailed, and systematic cosmology, one which constituted a scientific advance over previous models, if his motivations were primarily dialectical. The argument here seems to be, 1, that Parmenides appears to present his cosmology as an accurate depiction of the empirical world, and 2, that this putative accuracy is inconsistent with the dialectical interpretation's contention that the main purpose of the section is to dissuade us from accepting the reality of that world. Second, Tor argues that if we examine the fragments in question, there is no evidence of a dialectical teaching. In these passages, we find neither a general critique of cosmology as such, nor anything that would inoculate the reader against it. In short, Tor's contention is that the extant fragments of the Way of Opinion contain only expositions of a positive cosmology and reveal no traces of a dialectical argument. Thankfully, the kind of dialectical interpretation I have proposed, one grounded in the contrast between divine and mortal modes of cognition, has the resources to answer both objections. In response to the first objection, note, first, that statements can be accurate, or, in some sense, true, even when they fail to represent actual reality. For example, it is accurate to say that Pikachu is an electric type, even though there are no actual Pokemon in the world. And not only can such statements be accurate, but some of them can be more accurate than others. The assertion that Pikachu is an electric type, for instance, is more accurate than the assertion that he is a grass type. Furthermore, an avid fan might attempt to develop a novel, detailed, and systematic description of the world of Pokemon, all while remaining fully cognizant of the fact that the world he articulates is not the real world. At this point, one might object that even in the above-mentioned scenario, it is difficult to believe that anyone would construct such an account for purely dialectical purposes. Yet, to see how one might have a dialectical motive to construct an accurate and systematic characterization of a fictional world, imagine a case like that described in Plato's Allegory of the Cave, in which people are raised from birth in a simulated environment. To continue with our video game analogy, suppose that this population has been raised in an immersive VR environment, so that the only reality they have ever experienced is the reality presented to them in the game. And suppose further that someone had been taken out of that virtual world and was shown the real one. If, afterward, that person were to go back into the simulated world, as Parmenides must do to carry the goddess's message back to the mortal realm, there would be a danger of being seduced by the power of the immersive experience, and of forgetting what one had learned about the reality outside of the game. In such a scenario, one might attempt to construct the most accurate description of the game world available, so that, if one were to return to that world, he or she would remain cognizant of the fact that it was, indeed, a world of illusion. As the saying goes, forewarned is forearmed. Or, to use a different analogy, just as the prisoner seeking to escape incarceration will require an accurate map of the prison, so too do we, if we hope to evade the world of Maya and commune with the divine, have need of an accurate map of the world as it appears to the human mind. Thus, we can see how the goddess's novel, detailed, and systematic cosmology could be motivated by a dialectical agenda. Likewise, in response to the second objection, that there is no textual evidence of a dialectical intention, it should be noted, first, that arguments from absence carry little weight in contexts where the majority of a text is absent. Recall that scholars estimate that our extant fragments preserve only 10% of the way of opinion. So 90% of this section is missing. In contexts such as this, scholarly speculation, and even consensus, can be easily overturned with the discovery of new manuscript evidence, as was the case for Orphic and Empedocles scholarship when the contents of the Derveni and Strasbourg papyri were discovered. Moreover, we do have textual evidence of a dialectical intent in the way of opinion. To begin with, recall that the goddess has already expressly stated her dialectical purpose for the section in D8, when she contrasted the sure word of the way of truth with the deceptive order of her words in the way of opinion, and proclaimed that she teaches him this deceptive way so that no mortal mode of cognition might ever get past him. Indeed, it is hard to imagine the goddess putting the matter any more clearly. She is teaching Parmenides the way of opinion so that he can resist the seductions of ordinary human consciousness. Furthermore, the goddess's dialectical purpose is also evinced within her exposition of the world of human experience. For example, the theogony presented in the poem was said to be as brutal as that of Hesiod, and to have included castrations, enchainments of each other, and many other deeds of violence. And Cicero attests, quote, "But in this, no one could suspect either a divine shape or sensation. And he has many monsters too, for he assigns to a god war, discord, greed, and the other things of this sort, which are destroyed by sickness, sleep, forgetting, or old age, and the same for the stars." End quote. In presenting a theogony of a familiar anthropological sort, wherein the gods admit of all manner of moral and physical defects, the goddess would be offering something unacceptable to one who has experienced the mystical vision articulated in the way of truth, or understood its doctrine. Indeed, other philosophers of the era, such as Xenophanes and Phrasides, were critical of, and sought to reform, these crass, anthropomorphic depictions of the divine nature. The most straightforward explanation of why the goddess would expound such an unacceptable theogony, rather than trying to modify it as others did, is that she set it forth dialectically. If one trusts mortal appearances, one is led to unacceptable results. Indeed, even the goddess herself appears to curse the cosmos presented in the way of opinion. When speaking of the originary goddess who steers all things, fashions the other gods, and dispatches souls through the cycle of reincarnation, she declares that this deity, quote, "begins the hateful birth and mingling of all things, leading the female to mingle with the male, and again, in the opposite direction, the male with the female." End quote. The goddess thus explicitly rejects as hateful the world articulated in the way of human opinion. Again, such a negative judgment evinces the goddess's dialectical intention in articulating the world of human experience. To those initiated into the divine cognition elucidated in the way of truth, the depiction of the cosmos that presents itself to mortal cognition will appear as something hateful, and thus to be avoided. And similar problems attend the goddess's anthropological teachings. Theophrastus summarizes the epistemology of the way of opinion as follows, quote, Parmenides explained sensation by the similar. Parmenides did not define anything at all except that, the elements being two in number, knowledge is in accordance with the one that prevails. For when the hot or the cold dominates, the thought becomes different. The better and purer one of the two is the one produced by what is hot. But this one, too, requires a certain commensurability. For he speaks of sensation and thinking as being the same thing. This is why, for him, both memory and forgetting come about from these elements by their mixture. But the fact that he also explains sensation by one of the contraries taken by itself is clear from the passages in which he says that a corpse does not perceive light, heat, and sound because fire has withdrawn, but does perceive cold, silence, and the contraries, and in general that everything that exists possesses some knowledge. End quote. Recall that human cognition, according to the way of opinion, is structured by two opposing principles, light and night. Theophrastus here equates these with the elements of hot and cold, and associates them with two alternative ways of knowing. The possession of heat, for example, allows one to know objects that are light, hot, and emit sound, while the possession of cold, in contrast, allows one to know objects that are dark, cold, and silent. Thus, a corpse, since it has grown cold, would know silence, but it would not know sound, and a soul, if it were hot, would perceive sound, but not silence. Likewise, if Theophrastus also means to associate motion with heat and stillness with cold, then the cold corpse would know stillness, and the hot soul would know motion. Now, such an epistemology would lead to paradoxes for those who have taken up the Parmenidean life and adopted the doctrines of the way of truth. Recall, for example, that silence was essential for the practice of incubation. But, according to the way of opinion, a corpse, because it is cold, would have a better understanding of silence than a living soul, since the living soul remains hot and to that extent is incapable of knowing silence. This would, for example, lead to the paradoxical result that a corpse would make for a better iatromantis and pholarchos in that respect than would a living soul. Or again, if heat is correlated with motion and cold with stillness, the fundamental skill Parmenides learned from his teacher Amanius, then a lifeless corpse would be both better able to practice philosophy and better equipped to know the unmovability of being than would a living soul, since the soul, in virtue of its heat, could not know stillness. Such results would likely strike those committed to the way of truth as absurd, and again suggest a dialectical purpose in the way of opinion. Thus, in light of these observations, contemporary arguments should not dissuade us from taking the goddess at her word when she declares that she teaches the way of opinion to equip Parmenides to resist the illusions inherent in mortal cognition. Parmenides, speaking on behalf of the unnamed goddess, thus calls on us to choose between two realities and two corresponding states of consciousness. We can either awaken and heed the call of being, the I am that I am, which gives itself in mystical experience, or we can continue to slumber in the realm of light and night, fabricated by the human mind. In our beginning is thus our end, and we are confronted once more with the Seinsfrage and Apollo's injunction to know thyself. What are we, and who shall we be? Are we creatures of dust, condemned by time to dust to return, or something greater? For those with eyes to see, who have caught a glimpse of that greater something, the divine excess that lies beyond the visible, I suspect that the decision has already been made. The challenge is only to persist, and, like Parmenides, refusing to tarry with the world's illusions, to follow desire thus kindled back to its true source. The course of the daimon is, no doubt, perilous, but looking back yet more so. I went out to the hazelwood because a fire was in my head, and cut and peeled a hazel wand, and hooked a berry to a thread. And when white moths were on the wing, and moth-like stars were flickering out, I dropped the berry in a stream, and caught a little silver trout. When I had laid it on the floor, I went to blow the fire aflame. But something rustled on the floor, and someone called me by my name. It had become a glimmering girl, with apple blossom in her hair, who called me by my name and ran and faded through the brightening air. Though I am old with wandering through hollow lands and hilly lands, I will find out where she has gone, and kiss her lips and take her hands, and walk among long dappled grass, and pluck till time and times are done, the silver apples of the moon, the golden apples of the sun.